Hey there, night owls! Tonight we're stepping into one of history's messiest breakups, and I mean messy. We're talking about a king who literally rewrote his country's entire religion because he wanted a divorce. A woman who went from nobody's first choice to the most powerful queen in England, and then to the execution block in under 3 years. Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. You've seen the movies, you've heard the gossip. Yes, even 5 centuries later, people are still gossiping about these two. But here's the thing. Most of what you think you know, it's either half true or completely made up by her enemies. So before we dive into this royal disaster, do me a favour, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. London? Texas? Some insomniac corner of Australia? I genuinely want to know who's joining me for this journey through Tudor drama. Now dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's find out how the greatest love story in English history turned into its greatest tragedy. Ready? Let's go. The morning of May 19th, 1536 began like any other spring day in London. Birds sang in the trees surrounding the tower, merchants opened their stalls along the Thames, and servants across the city stirred fires back to life after the night's chill. But inside the royal apartments of the Tower of London, a woman was preparing for something no amount of spring sunshine could brighten. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, was getting dressed for the last time. Now let's pause here for a moment because the scene that unfolded that morning deserves your full attention. This wasn't some anonymous prisoner shuffling toward an anonymous fate. This was the Queen of England, the woman who had captured the heart of one of Europe's most powerful monarchs, the woman for whom Henry VIII had torn his kingdom away from the Catholic Church, defied the Pope, broken with centuries of religious tradition, and fundamentally altered the course of English history. And now, on this particular May morning, she was selecting which dress to wear to her own execution. If that doesn't make you sit up and pay attention, I'm not sure what will. The quarters where Anne spent her final night weren't the damp, rat-infested cells you might imagine when someone says Tower of London. No, Anne was held in the very same royal apartments where she had stayed just 3 years earlier, on the night before her triumphant coronation. The same rooms, the same view of the Tower Green, the same guards patrolling the same corridors. Only everything had changed. Back then she had been preparing to receive a crown. Now she was preparing to lose her head. History, it seems, has a rather dark sense of irony. The apartments themselves were comfortable enough, relatively speaking. They featured tapestries on the walls, proper furniture, even attendants to see to her needs. This wasn't exactly a 5-star hotel experience, but it was certainly better than the accommodations most prisoners of the Tudor state could expect. Then again, most prisoners of the Tudor state weren't queens. Most prisoners hadn't dined with kings and danced at royal balls. Most prisoners hadn't changed the religious landscape of an entire nation. Anne Boleyn was not most prisoners, and even in her final hours she was treated with a certain grudging respect that acknowledged her unique position. She rose early that morning, as she had every morning since her imprisonment began 19 days earlier. The waiting, perhaps, had been the worst part. Originally, she had been scheduled to die on the 18th, but a delay in the arrival of the executioner from Calais had pushed her appointment with eternity back by 1 day. Yes, you heard that correctly. Henry had specifically imported a swordsman from France to perform the deed, rather than relying on the traditional English axe. This was considered a mercy, if you can believe it. The French sword was reputed to be quicker, cleaner, more precise than the sometimes clumsy English axe, which had been known to require multiple strokes to finish the job. Henry, in his infinite generosity, had spared his former beloved wife the indignity of a botched beheading. How thoughtful of him! Anne, for her part, received this news of the delay with remarkable composure, though accounts suggest she had been psychologically preparing herself for death on the 18th, and found the postponement unsettling. "I hear say the executioner is very good," she reportedly told Sir William Kingston, the Constable of the Tower, "and I have a little neck." She then put her hands around her throat and laughed. Whether this was genuine courage, hysteria, or simply the dark humour of someone who had already made peace with her fate, we'll never know for certain. But it tells us something important about the woman Anne Boleyn was. Even facing death, she refused to crumble entirely. The dress she chose for her final morning was, by all accounts, a grey damask gown trimmed with fur, worn over a crimson kirtle. The colours were significant. Grey was associated with mourning in Tudor England, while crimson, that deep blood-red shade, was the colour of Catholic martyrdom. Whether Anne intended this symbolism or simply chose from whatever garments were available to her, the effect was striking. She would go to her death dressed as both a mourner and a martyr, a woman grieving her own fate while simultaneously proclaiming her innocence to anyone with eyes to see. Her hair, that famous dark hair that had allegedly bewitched a king, was pinned up carefully beneath a simple headdress. Some accounts describe her as looking pale but composed, her dark eyes steady, her bearing regal despite everything. Others suggest she appeared nervous, her hands trembling slightly as her ladies helped her prepare. Perhaps both accounts are true. Courage and fear are not mutually exclusive, and anyone facing what Anne faced that morning would be forgiven for experiencing both in equal measure. Around her, the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken emotion. Her ladies in waiting, those women who had attended her through triumph and disaster alike, moved quietly about their tasks, their eyes red from crying, their movements subdued. These were women who had seen Anne at her highest and her lowest. They had dressed her for her coronation, and now they were dressing her for her execution. The cruel symmetry of the situation could not have been lost on any of them. At approximately 8 o'clock in the morning, Anne was informed that the time had come. She would be escorted from her apartments to Tower Green, where a scaffold had been erected specifically for the occasion. Unlike common criminals who were executed publicly at Tower Hill where crowds could gather to witness their deaths, Anne would die in the relative privacy of the Tower's inner ward. Only a select group of witnesses, nobles, officials, members of the court, would be present to see the Queen of England meet her end. This was not a spectacle for the common people. This was state business, conducted with appropriate discretion. As she prepared to leave her apartments for the last time, Anne turned to the ladies who had attended her and made a request that speaks volumes about her character, even in these final moments. She asked them not to grieve for her, but to pray for her soul. She also distributed what few possessions she had left, small tokens, prayer books, personal items, as remembrances. These women who had served her would carry these mementos for the rest of their lives, tangible connections to a queen whose reign had been as brief as it was dramatic. The walk from the royal apartments to the scaffold on Tower Green was not a long one, a few hundred yards at most, but those few hundred yards must have felt like miles, each step bringing Anne closer to the wooden platform where her life would end. The morning was fine and clear, the sky blue above the grey stone walls of the tower. Spring flowers were blooming in the gardens. Life, in its relentless way, was carrying on all around her, indifferent to the drama unfolding within these ancient walls. A crowd had gathered to witness the execution, though crowd might be too strong a word. Perhaps 1,000 people, some estimates suggest, including the Lord Mayor of London and various aldermen, representatives of the nobility, and assorted officials whose presence was required by protocol. They stood in silence as Anne emerged, their faces a mixture of curiosity, horror, satisfaction, and in some cases genuine grief. Anne Boleyn had been a divisive figure in life, and she remained divisive even in death. Some in that crowd believed she was getting exactly what she deserved: a witch, a whore, a traitor to her husband and her king. Others believed they were witnessing a grave injustice, the murder of an innocent woman whose only crime had been failing to give Henry the son he so desperately wanted. The scaffold itself was a simple wooden structure, raised perhaps 4 or 5 feet above the ground so that the assembled witnesses could see clearly what was about to happen. There was no block. The French sword required the condemned to kneel upright, their neck exposed and unsupported. A bed of straw had been laid on the platform to absorb the blood. Practical considerations, even in matters of royal execution. Anne climbed the steps with assistance from her attendants. Her legs, reportedly, were unsteady, though whether from fear or simply from the weight of her elaborate dress is unclear. When she reached the top of the scaffold, she turned to face the assembled crowd and was permitted to speak. This was customary. Even traitors were allowed a few final words, though they were expected to acknowledge their crimes and ask forgiveness from the king they had wronged. Anne's speech would prove to be masterful in its careful ambiguity. "Good Christian people," she began, her voice steady enough to carry across the green, "I am come hither to die, according to law, for by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it." Notice what she did there. She acknowledged that she had been judged by law and sentenced to death. She did not say she was guilty. She did not say she was innocent. She said she had been judged and she accepted that judgment. It was a lawyer's distinction, the kind of careful passing of words that would have made any diplomat proud. She continued, speaking kindly of Henry, as was expected of any condemned person, calling him a gentle and sovereign lord and expressing her hope that he would long reign over England. Some historians have seen this as bitter irony, a final act of defiance disguised as submission. Others interpret it as genuine, the words of a woman who still loved the man who had ordered her death, or at least understood that speaking ill of him would only make things worse for those she left behind. Her daughter Elizabeth, after all, was still alive, still in Henry's power. Whatever Anne's true feelings, she was careful to say nothing that might endanger her child. "If any person will meddle with my cause," she added, "I require them to judge the best." This too was carefully worded. She was not proclaiming her innocence outright. That would have been seen as contempt for the court that had convicted her. But she was suggesting, gently, that those who examined her case closely might come to a different conclusion than the one reached by her judges. She was planting seeds of doubt even as she accepted her fate. When she had finished speaking, Anne removed her headdress and tucked her hair up under a simple cap, exposing the back of her neck. Her ladies assisted her in this, their hands shaking, their eyes blurred with tears. One of them tied a blindfold over Anne's eyes, another mercy, or perhaps a cruelty, depending on how you look at it. At least she would not see the blade coming. She knelt on the straw, her hands clasped in prayer, her lips moving silently. Some accounts say she repeated the phrase, "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul," over and over, a litany of faith in her final moments. The executioner, that imported French swordsman, so skilled in his grim trade, approached quietly, removing his shoes so that Anne would not hear his footsteps and flinch at the crucial moment. In one version of events he called out, "Bring me my sword," to distract her, causing her to turn her head slightly in the direction of his voice. In that moment of distraction he struck. The blade was swift. The cut was clean. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, second wife of Henry VIII, mother of the future Elizabeth I, was dead. She was approximately 35 years old, though her exact birth date remains disputed. Her reign as queen had lasted just over 1,000 days. Her time as the most powerful woman in England, as the object of a king's obsession, as the catalyst for a religious revolution, all of it ended in a single stroke of a French sword on a spring morning in 1536. Her body, still warm, was wrapped in white cloth by her weeping ladies. Because no coffin had been prepared, an oversight that speaks volumes about the hasty, almost improvisational nature of her execution, her remains were placed in an old arrow chest that happened to be available. This chest, designed to hold weapons of war, became the final resting place of a queen. She was buried without ceremony in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the small church within the Tower grounds where other executed nobles had been laid to rest. No marker was placed over her grave. No monument commemorated her passing. She was simply gone, as if Henry hoped that by erasing her physical presence he could erase her from history itself. He was wrong about that, as we shall see, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. The question that hangs over this entire scene, the question that must be burning in your mind right now if you have any curiosity at all, is simply this. How? How did we get here? How did a woman go from being the love of a king's life to being executed as a traitor in the space of just a few years? How did the great romance of the Tudor age, the relationship that literally changed the course of English history, end on a scaffold with a French sword and an improvised coffin? To answer that question, we need to go back. Way back. Back before the love letters and the secret marriages, before the religious upheaval and the political machinations, before Anne became a queen and then a prisoner. We need to go back to the beginning, to understand who Anne Boleyn actually was before she became the most famous and infamous woman in English history. And that story begins not in a royal palace, but in a comfortable country manor house in the Kent countryside. It begins with a little girl who had no idea that she would one day shake the foundations of a kingdom. It begins at a place called Hever Castle. There's a persistent myth about Anne Boleyn that refuses to die no matter how many historians try to kill it. The myth goes something like this. Anne was a nobody, a common girl of no particular distinction, who used her feminine wiles to seduce a king and claw her way to power from nothing. She was an upstart, an interloper, a social climber who got exactly what she deserved when the king finally saw through her schemes. This narrative has been repeated in countless books, films, and television dramas. It makes for a compelling story, the common girl who flies too close to the sun and gets burned. There's just one problem with this narrative. It's completely and utterly wrong. Anne Boleyn was not a nobody. She was not common. She was not even particularly lowborn by the standards of her time. She came from one of the most ambitious and well-connected families in Tudor England, a family that had been climbing the social ladder for generations and had already reached considerable heights by the time Anne was born. To understand Anne, we first need to understand the Boleyns, and to understand the Boleyns, we need to take a trip to the Kent countryside to visit a rather impressive piece of real estate known as Hever Castle. Now, when we say castle in this context, we should clarify what we're talking about. Hever was not one of those grim medieval fortresses with arrow slits and murder holes and dungeons full of forgotten prisoners. By the time the Boleyns acquired it in 1462, it was more of a fortified manor house, comfortable, substantial, and decidedly respectable. It had a moat because of course it did. What self-respecting English country house didn't have a moat in the 15th century? It had defensive walls and a gatehouse that spoke to its medieval origins. But it also had pleasant rooms, proper fireplaces, gardens, and all the amenities expected by a family of means and ambition. The Boleyns had acquired Hever through the time-honoured method of marrying well. Geoffrey Boleyn, Anne's great-grandfather, had been a prosperous London merchant, a mercer dealing in fine fabrics and textiles. He had made a considerable fortune through trade and had used that fortune to purchase respectability. He served as Lord Mayor of London in 1457, a position of tremendous prestige. His son, William Boleyn, married Margaret Butler, the daughter of an Irish earl. Their son, Thomas Boleyn, Anne's father, would climb even higher. This is important to understand because it reveals something fundamental about Anne's family. The Boleyns were climbers, yes. They were ambitious, certainly. But they were not common. They were not peasants or merchants pretending to be nobles. By the time Anne was born, her family had been part of the gentry for several generations. They held land. They had connections at court. They were exactly the sort of family that the Tudor system was designed to accommodate, wealthy enough to matter, ambitious enough to serve, and clever enough to know how to play the game. Thomas Boleyn, Anne's father, was perhaps the most successful Boleyn yet. He was intelligent, educated, multilingual, and utterly devoted to advancing his family's position. He had been present at the court of Henry VII and continued to serve under Henry VIII, undertaking diplomatic missions to the continent and earning the trust of the young king. He was known for his skill with languages. He spoke fluent French and Latin, and could get by in several other tongues as well. This linguistic ability would prove invaluable in his diplomatic career, and would be passed on to his children. In 1499, Thomas Boleyn made an advantageous marriage to Elizabeth Howard, daughter of the Duke of Norfolk. This was a significant step up the social ladder. The Howards were one of the premier noble families in England, and by marrying into their ranks, Thomas Boleyn was connecting his merchant-descended family to the highest levels of the English aristocracy. Elizabeth Howard brought not only social prestige but also her own intelligence and ambition to the partnership. Together they would raise 3 children who survived to adulthood: Mary, Anne, and George. Anne was born sometime around 1501 or 1502, though the exact date remains disputed. Some historians have argued for an earlier birth date, perhaps 1500 or even 1499, while others have suggested she might have been born as late as 1507. The confusion arises because birth records for girls of Anne's status were not kept with particular care. Daughters were important primarily as marriage prospects, and their precise age mattered less than their health, their education, and their ability to bear children. What we know for certain is that Anne was the second of the 3 Boleyn children to survive infancy, younger than her sister Mary, and older than her brother George. Growing up at Hever Castle, Anne would have experienced a childhood that was privileged by any reasonable standard. The castle was comfortable and well appointed, surrounded by the gentle Kent countryside with its rolling hills, its orchards, its fields of grain. The Boleyn children would have had servants to attend them, tutors to educate them, and all the material comforts that wealth could provide in early Tudor England. This was not the life of a peasant or a commoner. This was the life of the aspiring gentry, and it came with expectations. Those expectations began with education. Thomas Boleyn, himself a learned man, was determined that his children should be educated to the highest possible standard. This was not merely a matter of personal preference, it was a strategic decision. In the Tudor world, education was a pathway to advancement. A well-educated child could serve at court, could undertake diplomatic missions, could attract the attention of powerful patrons. Thomas Boleyn invested in his children's education the way a modern parent might invest in their children's university fund, knowing that the returns could be substantial. For the Boleyn girls, this education included reading and writing in English and French, music, dancing, needlework, and all the accomplishments expected of well-bred young women. But it went beyond the merely decorative. Anne and Mary were taught to think, to converse, to hold their own in intellectual company. They were prepared not just to be ornaments in some noble household, but to be active participants in the sophisticated world of Renaissance courts. Hever Castle itself still stands today, though it has been extensively renovated and restored over the centuries. Visitors can walk through rooms where the Boleyn family once lived, can see the gardens where Anne might have played as a child, can even view what is claimed to be Anne's childhood prayer book. This last item is particularly intriguing because of an inscription it contains, an inscription that would later seem almost eerily prophetic. Written in the margins of the prayer book, in what is believed to be Anne's own hand, are the French words "Le temps viendra," followed by the signature Anne Boleyn. The phrase translates to "the time will come." Some historians have interpreted this as a personal motto, a statement of ambition and patience. Others see it as a simple exercise in penmanship, a young girl practicing her French and her signature without any deeper meaning intended. Still others have suggested that the inscription might have been added later, when Anne was already at court and already dreaming of greater things. Whatever the truth behind this inscription, it captures something essential about Anne's character as it would later develop. She was, by all accounts, a patient woman, patient and calculating, willing to wait for the right moment, willing to play the long game when necessary. Whether she learned this patience at Hever, or developed it later during her years at foreign courts, it would prove to be one of her most valuable assets. And one of her most dangerous ones, as it turned out. Patience in a woman was admired. Patience combined with ambition, intelligence, and the ability to say no to a king, that was altogether more threatening. The childhood years at Hever were formative but relatively brief. Thomas Boleyn's ambitions for his children extended far beyond what rural Kent could offer. If his daughters were to make advantageous marriages, if they were to take their place among the elite of English society, they needed more polish than even the best English tutors could provide. They needed continental experience. They needed to be finished at one of the great courts of Europe. And so, at an age when most modern children are still in elementary school, Anne Boleyn was sent abroad to complete her education. It was a decision that would transform her from a promising English gentlewoman into something altogether more exotic and compelling. It was a decision that would ultimately put her on a collision course with the King of England himself. But that part of the story requires a new chapter, because Anne's years abroad were not just a finishing school experience. They were an immersion in a world of sophistication, intrigue, and danger that would shape everything she later became. The girl who left Hever Castle was talented and well-bred. The woman who returned was something else entirely, something that Tudor England had never quite seen before. Before we follow Anne across the English Channel, though, let's linger a moment longer at Hever. Let's try to picture what life was like there in those early years of the 16th century, when Anne was still just a child and no one could possibly have predicted the extraordinary path her life would take. The castle would have been busy with the rhythms of rural life. Servants would have moved through the corridors, tending fires, preparing meals, cleaning rooms that never quite stayed clean no matter how much effort was expended. It was a self-contained world in many ways, this country estate, with its own economy and its own social hierarchy. Anne would have been expected to learn her place within this hierarchy from an early age. She was the daughter of the house, yes, which gave her certain privileges, but she was also a girl in a world that valued boys more highly, a second daughter in a family where the first daughter would typically receive preferential treatment in matters of marriage and inheritance. She would have learned to navigate these realities, to find her own space within the family structure, to develop the skills that would allow her to make her mark despite being neither male nor firstborn. We don't know much about Anne's relationship with her siblings during these early years, but we can make some educated guesses. Mary, the eldest daughter, seems to have been considered the beauty of the family, softer, more conventionally attractive, less sharp-edged than her younger sister. George, the only son, would have been the focus of much of the family's hopes and ambitions, the heir who would carry the Boleyn name forward. Anne, as the middle child and second daughter, might have had more freedom to develop her own personality for good or ill. She was important enough to be educated and prepared for a good marriage, but not so important that her every move was scrutinized and controlled. This relative freedom might help explain the personality that would later emerge at the Tudor court, that famous combination of wit, intelligence, independence, and sharp tongue that would both attract Henry VIII and ultimately contribute to her downfall. Children who are neither the favourite nor the disappointment often develop a certain resilience, a certain willingness to push boundaries that their more closely watched siblings do not. Whether this was true of Anne specifically, we cannot say for certain, but it's a pattern that fits what we know of her later character. The religion of the Boleyn household during Anne's childhood would have been conventional Catholicism. There was no other option in England at that time. The children would have been taught their prayers, would have attended Mass, would have learned the rhythms of the liturgical year with its feasts and fasts, its saints' days and holy seasons. There is no evidence that the Boleyns were particularly devout or particularly lax in their religious observance. They were, like most English families of their class, conventionally pious without being fanatical about it. This would change, of course. Anne would later become associated with religious reform, with the evangelical movement that sought to challenge Catholic doctrine and practice. Some historians have traced this interest back to her years in France, where she may have been exposed to humanist and reformist ideas. Others suggest that her religious views developed later, after her return to England. Still others argue that her religious commitments have been exaggerated by both her supporters and her detractors, and that she was never quite the Protestant heroine or Catholic villainess that different factions have claimed. What seems clear is that the seeds of inquiry were planted early. Anne was curious, intellectually engaged, unwilling to simply accept what she was told without examination. These traits would serve her well in some contexts and make her dangerous in others. A curious, questioning woman was not what Tudor society generally wanted or expected. Such women were tolerated when they were useful and suppressed when they became inconvenient. The physical appearance of young Anne is another subject of considerable debate and speculation. No authenticated portrait of her survives from her childhood, and the portraits we have from her adult years are copies of copies, their accuracy uncertain. What the documentary evidence suggests is that she was not considered a conventional beauty. Her sister Mary was the pretty one, the one whose looks conformed to contemporary standards. Anne's appeal was different, more about presence, wit and style than about the perfection of her features. Later, some hostile sources mention a sixth finger on one hand or a large mole on her neck, but these descriptions come from people who had every reason to portray her as a witch or a freak, and they should be treated with considerable skepticism. The truth is probably more mundane. Anne was attractive but not beautiful in the conventional sense, and her real power lay in her intelligence, her education, and her ability to captivate those around her with her conversation and her presence. One detail that multiple sources agree on is that Anne possessed remarkable eyes. Dark, expressive and compelling, they were apparently one of her most striking features. One French poet who knew her later in life described her as having eyes that invited to conversation, suggesting a kind of knowing, engaging quality that drew people in. In an era when women were often valued primarily for their physical appearance and their fertility, Anne's ability to engage intellectually and emotionally with those around her was unusual and powerful. As Anne grew from a small child into a young girl, her father's ambitions for his children were taking concrete shape. Thomas Boleyn was constantly networking, constantly looking for opportunities to advance his family's position. His diplomatic missions to the continent had given him contacts at foreign courts, and he was not shy about using those contacts to benefit his children. The opportunity he was seeking came in 1513, when Anne was perhaps 12 years old. The perfect age by the standards of the time for a girl to begin her real education in the ways of the world. The opportunity came in the form of an invitation. Margaret of Austria, regent of the Netherlands and one of the most powerful women in Europe, was assembling a household of young noblewomen to serve as her maids of honour. These positions were highly sought after. They offered young women the chance to complete their education at one of the most sophisticated courts in Europe, to learn languages and courtly manners, to make connections that could lead to advantageous marriages. For an ambitious father like Thomas Boleyn, securing such a position for one of his daughters was a coup. The records suggest that Anne was the daughter chosen for this honour, though some historians have argued that Mary went first and Anne followed later. In any case, we know that Anne spent time at the court of Margaret of Austria, learning French, studying music and dancing, absorbing the refined culture of the Burgundian Netherlands. It was here that she began her transformation from a well-bred English girl into a cosmopolitan woman of the world. Margaret of Austria was an extraordinary figure in her own right. A woman who had been betrothed to the King of France as a child, married to the heir of Spain at 17, widowed at 18 when her husband died in an accident, married again to the Duke of Savoy, and widowed again when he died just 3 years later. She had sworn never to marry a third time and had been entrusted by her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, with governing the Netherlands on his behalf. She was cultured, intelligent, politically astute, and devoted to the arts. Her court was a centre of learning and refinement, and the young women who served in her household received an education that was second to none. We have a letter from Margaret to Thomas Boleyn, written around this time, in which she praises his daughter's accomplishments. "I find her of such good qualities that I am more beholden to you for sending her to me than you are to me," Margaret wrote, or words to that effect, as the letter survives only in translation. It was high praise indeed. and it suggests that Anne was already making an impression even at this young age. But Anne's time in the Netherlands was relatively brief. By 1514, political circumstances had changed, and Thomas Boleyn had secured an even more impressive opportunity for his daughter. Henry VIII's younger sister Mary was being sent to France to marry the aging King Louis XVIII, and she needed English ladies to attend her. Anne Boleyn was among those chosen to accompany the royal bride across the Channel. This was a tremendous step up. The French court was the most glamorous in Europe, the centre of Renaissance culture and learning. King Louis XIII was old and sickly and not expected to live long, but his heir, Francis, was young, vibrant, and already known for his patronage of the arts and his appreciation of beautiful, intelligent women. For a young woman looking to complete her education and develop her skills, there was no better place to be. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. Before Anne crossed the Channel to France, before she learned to speak French so perfectly that she would later be mistaken for a native, before she encountered the sophisticated world that would shape her into the woman who would captivate a king, before all of that, she was still just a girl at Hever Castle, learning her letters, saying her prayers, and inscribing that prophetic phrase in her prayer book, Le temps viendra. The time will come. And it would. The time would come for Anne Boleyn to become famous, infamous, beloved, hated, celebrated, and condemned. The time would come for her to change the course of English history, to challenge the most powerful institution in the Western world, to give birth to one of England's greatest monarchs. The time would come for her to know both the heights of power and the depths of despair, to be queen of a great nation and prisoner in its most feared fortress. But all of that was still years away. For now, Anne was simply a child growing up in a comfortable country house, surrounded by her family, unaware of the destiny that awaited her. She played in the gardens of Hever Castle. She learned her lessons from her tutors. She squabbled with her siblings, as children do. She looked out over the Kent countryside and perhaps wondered what lay beyond those gentle hills, beyond the narrow horizon of her childhood world. The answer, as it turned out, was everything. Everything lay beyond. The world was waiting for Anne Boleyn, and Anne Boleyn, whether she knew it or not, was preparing to meet it. So let us leave young Anne at Hever for now, that prayer book in her hands, those prophetic words on her lips. The time has not yet come for her story to accelerate toward its famous conclusion. There are still chapters to write, years to live, experiences to accumulate. France awaits. The court of King Francis awaits. The education that will transform Anne from a promising English girl into something altogether more dangerous awaits. And somewhere in the future, waiting like a storm on the horizon, Henry VIII awaits. But he doesn't know it yet. He's still married to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, still hoping for a son, still unaware that his destiny is tangled up with that of a dark-eyed girl from Kent, who is, at this moment, just beginning to learn how to navigate the treacherous waters of Renaissance courts. Let us turn now to those waters. Let us follow Anne across the English Channel to the most dazzling court in Europe. Let us watch as she transforms from a schoolgirl into a sophisticated woman of the world. Let us see how France made Anne Boleyn into the woman who would make and unmake herself. The next phase of Anne's life would be her most formative. The 9 years she spent in France would shape her personality, her tastes, her ambitions and her skills in ways that would prove both her making and her undoing. She arrived as a child. She would leave as something else entirely, something that England had never quite seen before, and something that would shake the Tudor world to its foundations. The Boleyns' neighbours in Kent, watching Thomas load his daughter into a carriage for the journey to the coast, could not possibly have known what they were witnessing. They saw only a merchant's granddaughter being sent off to France for some polish, nothing more. The idea that this girl would one day be Queen of England, that she would help tear the English Church away from Rome, that she would become one of the most famous women in history, such thoughts would have seemed laughable. But time, as Anne herself wrote, has a way of coming. The hours and days and years were passing, carrying Anne toward a future that would make her immortal, for better or worse. The quiet girl from Hever Castle was about to step onto a much larger stage. And so we close this chapter where we began, with a sense of anticipation, a feeling that something significant is about to unfold. We have met Anne as a child, traced her origins, explored the castle where she grew up and the family that shaped her. We have seen that she was not the common upstart of legend, but a well-born gentlewoman with advantages and education that few English women of her time could match. But what she would do with those advantages, how she would use her education and her wit and her famous dark eyes, that is a story that requires more time to tell. France awaits, and France, as we shall see, was where Anne Boleyn truly became herself. For now, let the young Anne rest at Hever Castle, that prophetic prayer book in her possession, her future stretching out before her like an unwritten story. The time will come when we return to her, when we follow her to the glittering courts of Europe and finally to the court of Henry VIII himself. But that time is not quite yet, so let your eyes grow heavy if they will. Let the story settle into your mind like water finding its level. Tomorrow, or whenever you return to this tale, we will take up where we left off. We will follow Anne to France, watch her transformation, trace her path toward destiny. For now, know only this: she was not a nobody. She was not a commoner playing above her station. She was Anne Boleyn, daughter of an ambitious family, inheritor of intelligence and wit and determination. She was exactly the kind of woman who could captivate a king, and exactly the kind of woman who could terrify a court. Remember that image of her on the scaffold? The grey damask dress, the crimson kirtle, the steady dark eyes. Remember the question we asked: how did she get there? Now we know a little more. We know where she came from. We know the family that made her. We know the childhood home that shaped her early years. But to truly understand how Anne Boleyn ended up on that scaffold on that May morning in 1536, we need to go further. We need to understand the woman she became in those 9 transformative years abroad. We need to grasp how she came to the attention of Henry VIII and what happened when 2 equally strong-willed, equally ambitious, equally dangerous personalities collided. That, my friends, is a story for another chapter, but the groundwork has been laid. The foundation has been established. Anne Boleyn's story is now truly underway, and what a story it is. Sleep well, and dream perhaps of Hever Castle, its moat shimmering in the Kent sunshine, its rooms filled with the sounds of a household going about its daily business, its gardens bright with the flowers of an English summer. Dream of a little girl with dark eyes and a sharp mind, writing French phrases in the margins of her prayer book, unaware that those words would one day seem like prophecy. Le temps viendra. The time will come. It came for Anne Boleyn. It changed everything. And in the chapters ahead, we'll trace exactly how and why. Rest now. The story continues soon. And trust me when I say, the best is yet to come. The courts of Europe await. The King of England awaits. The greatest drama of the Tudor age awaits. And Anne Boleyn is walking toward it all step by step, unaware of what lies ahead, but somehow, perhaps, ready to meet it. That's the thing about destiny, isn't it? It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't send warning letters or schedule appointments. It just arrives, usually when you least expect it, and suddenly everything is different. Anne Boleyn's destiny was waiting for her across the English Channel, in the halls of French palaces and eventually in the bedchamber of an English king. But she didn't know that yet, and neither, for that matter, did Henry VIII. In 1513 or 1514, when Anne was first leaving England for the continent, Henry was still a young king, married to Catherine of Aragon, full of optimism about the future. He had no idea that a dark-eyed girl from Kent was about to derail his entire life, his entire reign, his entire legacy. Fate, it seems, enjoys its little surprises, and the biggest surprise of Henry VIII's life was still a decade away, learning to dance and speak French and charm everyone she met at the most sophisticated court in Europe. Let that thought accompany you into sleep. The players are being positioned on the board. The moves that will lead to checkmate or disaster are not yet being made, but the game is being set up. Anne is learning the skills she will need. Henry is living the life he will eventually abandon. Catherine is enjoying a security she will one day lose. And England, unaware, is continuing on a path it will soon depart forever. History, as they say, doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And the rhyme scheme of Anne Boleyn's story was being written in those early years, in a castle in Kent and a court in France, in the ambitions of a climbing family and the education of a clever girl. We've heard the opening stanzas now. The rest of the poem awaits. Good night, and we'll continue the story soon. There's so much more to tell: romance and rivalry, politics and passion, triumph and tragedy. All of it centred on one remarkable woman who rose higher than anyone could have predicted and fell harder than anyone could have imagined. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, executed traitor, mother of Elizabeth VIII, the woman who changed history. Her story is just beginning, and what a story it will be. But before we leave this chapter entirely, let us dwell a little longer on some aspects of Anne's early life that deserve further exploration. After all, we are just beginning this journey together, and there is no rush. The scaffold will still be there when we reach the end of the tale. For now, let us take our time with the beginning. Consider for a moment what it would have been like to be a child of Anne's class in early Tudor England. The world was simultaneously smaller and larger than ours. Smaller because most people lived their entire lives within a few miles of where they were born, knowing the same faces, walking the same lanes, attending the same church from cradle to grave. Larger because the unknown stretched out in every direction, unknown lands, unknown peoples, unknown dangers lurking just beyond the familiar horizon. For Anne, growing up at Hever, the familiar world would have been bounded by the castle walls, the surrounding estates, the village, perhaps occasional trips to London or to the homes of relatives. But the unfamiliar world was present too, in the form of her father's stories from his diplomatic travels, in the letters that arrived from foreign courts, in the gossip about kings and queens and the great affairs of state that filtered down even to a country house in Kent. Children absorb more than we often give them credit for. Sitting quietly in a corner while adults talk, playing nearby while her father entertained visitors, listening to her mother and her mother's ladies discussing the news of the day. Through all these small moments, Anne would have been learning about the world beyond Hever's moat. She would have learned that there were courts where people dressed magnificently and spoke in French. She would have learned that kings held power over life and death, that queens produced heirs or faced disgrace, that everything in life, including marriage, children, and one's very survival, was a matter of politics and power. These were not abstract lessons for a child of Anne's background. They were practical knowledge, as essential as learning to read or to sew. She would need this understanding if she were to navigate the world successfully. Her parents were preparing her not just for marriage but for survival, in an environment where a single misstep could mean ruin. The domestic routine at Hever would have followed patterns that were centuries old. Rising with the sun, attending morning prayers, breaking fast with the household, lessons with tutors, needlework and music practice, dinner in the great hall, more work or leisure in the afternoon, evening prayers, supper, and early to bed. There was little privacy in such households. Servants were everywhere, family members moved through shared spaces, and the idea of having one's own room in the modern sense was largely unknown except for the most privileged. This constant proximity meant that Anne would have learned from an early age to present herself, to be always on, in a sense that modern people might find exhausting. There was no retreating to one's room to relax and be oneself, no casual dress or informal behaviour. One was always being observed, always being judged, always performing the role of a gentlewoman's daughter. This training in self-presentation would serve Anne well later in life, when she would need to maintain her composure under circumstances far more stressful than the daily routine at Hever. The education Anne received at home before her departure for the continent would have laid essential groundwork for everything that came after. Reading and writing in English were fundamental. The ability to conduct correspondence, to manage accounts, to read devotional texts. Latin was taught to some degree, though Anne's fluency in that language remains uncertain. French, however, seems to have been emphasised from an early age, perhaps because Thomas Boleyn recognised its importance in diplomatic and court circles. Music was another essential accomplishment. Anne learned to play the lute and the virginals, and she was trained in singing. These were not mere hobbies, but crucial social skills. Musical ability was highly valued in Tudor court culture, and a woman who could perform well was at a considerable advantage in social situations. Later, at the courts of France and England, Anne's musical talents would help her stand out among her peers. Dancing, too, was taught from childhood. Tudor dancing was not the free-form expression we might imagine today, but a formal, choreographed affair involving precise steps, proper posture, and careful coordination with one's partner. It was, in effect, a form of performance art, and those who excelled at it earned admiration and attention. Anne would become famous for her dancing, capable of moves that impressed even the sophisticated courtiers of France. Needlework occupied much of a gentlewoman's time and was considered a proper and virtuous activity. Anne and her sister would have spent hours with their needles, creating embroidered decorations, working on tapestries, producing the elaborate decorative work that adorned clothing and household furnishings. This was not merely busy work. The results of skilled needlework were valuable, and the ability to produce fine work was considered a mark of proper feminine education. Religious instruction rounded out the curriculum. Anne would have learned her catechism, memorized prayers, and absorbed the basic tenets of Catholic Christianity. The church was not merely a religious institution, but a social one, the centre around which community life revolved. Baptisms, marriages, funerals, the great festivals of the Christian year, all of these were church occasions, and a proper understanding of religious observance was essential for full participation in society. Yet even this conventional religious education may have contained the seeds of later questioning. The church in early Tudor England was not without its critics. There were whispered complaints about corrupt clergy, about the wealth of monasteries, about indulgences and relics and practices that seemed to have strayed far from the simplicity of the Gospels. Whether Anne heard such whispers as a child at Hever we cannot say, but the humanist movement that was sweeping through European intellectual circles was placing new emphasis on scripture, on returning to original texts, on questioning traditional interpretations. These ideas would find their way into Anne's life eventually, though perhaps not until her time in France. The physical world of Hever Castle shaped Anne's experience in ways both obvious and subtle. The moat that surrounded the house, for instance, created a clear boundary between the domestic world inside and the wider world outside. To enter or leave Hever, one crossed the moat via the drawbridge, a daily reminder of the distinction between the security of home and the uncertainties beyond. This psychological sense of boundaries, of inside and outside, of safety and danger, would have been absorbed almost unconsciously by the children who grew up there. The gardens of Hever, which have been extensively restored in modern times but which certainly existed in some form during Anne's childhood, provided space for outdoor activity and recreation. Tudor gardens were not the wild, naturalistic spaces we might favour today, but carefully ordered arrangements of beds and paths, designed to demonstrate human mastery over nature. Herbs for cooking and medicine, flowers for beauty and fragrance, fruit trees and vegetables for the table, all were laid out according to plan. Walking in such gardens, Anne would have absorbed lessons about order, about design, about the proper arrangement of things. These aesthetic sensibilities would later manifest in her attention to fashion and self-presentation. The Great Hall of Hever, where the household gathered for meals and where visitors were received, was the social centre of the house. Here, she would have watched how power operated on a small scale, how deference was shown, how requests were made, how relationships were negotiated. All of this was preparation for the larger stages on which she would later perform. The chapel at Hever, where the family gathered for daily prayers, connected the household to the larger religious life of Christendom. The rituals performed there, the masses, the prayers for the dead, the celebrations of holy days, tied this small community in Kent to millions of other Christians across Europe, all performing the same rituals in the same language, all acknowledging the same spiritual hierarchy that stretched from the parish priest to the Pope in Rome. Anne could not have known, kneeling in that chapel as a child, that she would one day play a role in severing England from that hierarchy. The religious certainties of her childhood would not survive into her adulthood. As we consider Anne's early years, we should also spare a thought for the women who shaped her daily experience. Her mother, Elizabeth Howard, was by all accounts an intelligent and capable woman, well connected through her family to the highest levels of English nobility. She would have served as Anne's primary model of adult womanhood, demonstrating through her daily actions what was expected of a gentlewoman, a wife, a mother, a manager of household affairs. The other women of the household, ladies' maids, servants, perhaps nurses or governesses, also played their part in Anne's upbringing. These women, whose names are largely lost to history, taught practical skills, supervised daily activities, and provided the constant adult presence that child-rearing in this period required. Anne learned from all of them, absorbing lessons about how women navigated a world controlled by men, how they exercised influence within the constraints placed upon them, how they survived and sometimes thrived. The men of the household, apart from her father and brother, would have been more distant figures for Anne. Male servants and estate workers went about their business, interacting with the women of the house only as necessity required. This gender segregation was normal for the time and would have reinforced Anne's understanding of the different spheres occupied by men and women, the different expectations placed on each sex, the different paths available to each. Yet Anne's father seems to have taken an unusual interest in his daughter's education, perhaps recognizing that well-educated women could be valuable assets in the game of social advancement. His willingness to send both Mary and Anne abroad for their education, to invest in their refinement, suggests that he saw them as more than mere breeding stock to be married off at the first opportunity. He wanted daughters who could shine at court, who could attract powerful men, who could raise the profile of the Boleyn family through their accomplishments as well as their marriages. This investment would pay off spectacularly, though not in ways Thomas Boleyn could possibly have anticipated. Both his daughters would catch the eye of Henry VIII. Mary would become the king's mistress, bearing him children whose royal paternity was widely acknowledged though never officially claimed. Anne would refuse to settle for less than everything, and in pursuing everything, would both win and lose more than anyone could have imagined. But we are getting ahead of ourselves again. At Hever, in those early years, the future remained unwritten. Anne was simply a child growing up in comfortable circumstances, receiving the education appropriate to her station, absorbing the values and assumptions of her time and place. She was clever, yes, probably cleverer than most. She was ambitious, or at least she came from an ambitious family that would have instilled ambition in her. She was talented in the accomplishments valued by her society, but so were many girls of her class. What made Anne different, what set her on the path to becoming Anne Boleyn, the Anne Boleyn of history, would only emerge later through the transformative experiences that awaited her across the English Channel. Some historians have tried to find in Anne's childhood the seeds of her ultimate fate, as if her execution were somehow foreordained from birth. This is a tempting but ultimately misleading approach. There was nothing in Anne's early years that made her destiny inevitable. Thousands of girls of similar backgrounds lived, married, bore children, and died without ever making a mark on history. Anne's trajectory was shaped by circumstances and choices that could not have been predicted when she was a child at Hever, playing in the gardens, learning her letters, saying her prayers in the chapel. What we can say is that Anne was prepared. By the time she left Hever for the continent, she had the foundation she would need to take advantage of the opportunities that came her way. She could read and write. She could speak enough French to continue her education abroad. She could play music, dance, and present herself with the grace expected of a gentlewoman. She had absorbed the values of her class and her time, understood the rules of the game she would be playing, and possessed the intelligence to play it well. The rest, the glory and the tragedy, the crown and the scaffold, would come later. But it would build on this foundation, this childhood at Hever Castle, this education among the Kent hills and fields. Anne Boleyn was not made in a day or a year or even a decade. She was built slowly, piece by piece, skill by skill, experience by experience. The child at Hever was the first draft of the woman who would become queen. Let us also consider the broader context of the world into which Anne was born. The early 16th century was a time of tremendous change across Europe. The Renaissance, which had begun in Italy more than a century earlier, was spreading northward, bringing with it new ideas about art, literature, philosophy, and the nature of human potential. The printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg in the 1450s, was revolutionizing the spread of information, making books cheaper and more widely available than ever before. Martin Luther's challenge to the Catholic Church was still a few years in the future when Anne was a child, but the intellectual and spiritual ferment that would give rise to the Reformation was already building. England, at the time of Anne's birth, was emerging from a period of civil strife. The Wars of the Roses, that bloody conflict between the houses of York and Lancaster, had ended in 1485 when Henry Tudor defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field and became King Henry VII. The new Henry VII was a cautious, calculating king, more concerned with filling his treasury than with military glory. He ruled through careful administration rather than dramatic gestures. His son, the future Henry VIII, was born in 1491, roughly a decade before Anne. He was the second son, not originally expected to inherit the throne. That honour belonged to his older brother Arthur. But Arthur's death in 1502, just months after his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, changed everything. Young Henry became heir apparent, and in 1509, upon his father's death, he became king at the age of 17. The young Henry VIII was everything his father was not: athletic, extravagant, charming, and eager for glory. He loved music and dancing, jousting and hunting, feasting and display. He surrounded himself with brilliant men, scholars, artists, musicians, diplomats, and made his court one of the most dazzling in Europe. He married his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, with papal dispensation to overcome the prohibition against marrying one's deceased brother's wife. It was, by all appearances, a love match as well as a political alliance, and the early years of the marriage were happy ones. Anne Boleyn, growing up at Hever, would have heard of these events. She would have known that England had a young, glamorous king who loved all the accomplishments that she herself was learning. She might have dreamed, as girls do, of one day attending his court, dancing at his revels, being noticed by the great men who surrounded the throne. She could not have known that she would do all of this and more, that she would capture the king's heart, share his bed, wear his crown, and ultimately lose her head at his command. The world Anne inhabited as a child was also a world of tremendous inequality, where the gap between rich and poor was vast and largely unbridged. While Anne learned to play the lute and practice her French at Hever Castle, the vast majority of English children were working in fields, helping with livestock, learning the trades that would occupy them for the rest of their lives. Most would never learn to read. Most would never travel more than a few miles from their birthplace. Most would die before reaching what we would consider middle age, their lives shortened by disease, malnutrition, and the general hardships of pre-modern existence. Anne's privileges were real, and they set her apart from most of her contemporaries. But they also came with expectations and constraints that we might find stifling. Her life was not her own to direct as she pleased. Her father would decide whom she married, where she lived, what role she would play in the family's ambitions. Her value to her family lay primarily in the advantageous match she might make, the children she might bear, the connections she might forge. Personal fulfillment, romantic love, individual choice, these were luxuries that even wealthy women of Anne's class could rarely afford. And yet, within these constraints, there was room for manoeuvre. Clever women found ways to exercise influence, to shape their own destinies, to make their voices heard. Anne would prove to be exceptionally clever, and she would push against the boundaries of her world in ways that both liberated and endangered her. She would refuse to be merely a mistress, demanding instead the role of wife and queen. She would advocate for religious reform, aligning herself with a movement that challenged the established order. She would speak her mind, assert her will, and insist on being treated as something more than a breeding machine or a decorative ornament. These tendencies were not yet apparent in the child at Hever, but the seeds were there, waiting for the right conditions to germinate. France would provide those conditions. The sophisticated, intellectually vibrant court of King Francis III would show Anne what was possible, would give her models of powerful women who wielded influence openly, would expose her to ideas and fashions and behaviours that would set her apart from ordinary English gentlewomen. But all of that was still in the future. For now, Anne was simply a child, absorbing the lessons of her environment, developing the skills she would need, waiting for her time to come. The seasons turned at Hever as they turned everywhere. Spring with its promise of renewal, summer with its warmth and abundance, autumn with its harvest, winter with its cold and darkness. Anne grew from an infant to a toddler, from a toddler to a child, from a child to a young girl on the verge of womanhood. Her body changed, her mind developed, her understanding of the world deepened. Each year brought new lessons, new experiences, new challenges. And then one day the letter arrived. The opportunity Thomas Boleyn had been working toward had materialized. His daughter had been invited to join the household of one of the great ladies of Europe. Anne's childhood was ending. Her real education was about to begin. We will follow her on that journey in due course. But for now, let us hold this image of young Anne at Hever. Curious, intelligent, ambitious, preparing herself for a future she cannot yet imagine. Let us remember that before she was a queen, before she was a scandal, before she was a tragedy, she was simply a girl from Kent with dark eyes and quick wit, and a prayer book in which she had written words that would seem, in retrospect, almost prophetic. Le temps viendra. The time will come. It was coming even then. The time was approaching when Anne Boleyn would step onto the stage of history and play a role that would make her immortal. She didn't know it yet. No one at Hever could have guessed it. But history was waiting for her, patient and inevitable. And now, truly, we must bring this chapter to a close. We have lingered long enough in Kent, long enough in childhood, long enough in the years before everything changed. The next phase of Anne's story awaits, her years in France, her transformation into a sophisticated woman of the world, her return to England and her fateful encounter with the king. So let your breathing slow and your body relax. Let the story settle into your mind like sediment in still water. When next we meet, we will cross the English Channel with young Anne Boleyn and discover the glittering world that awaited her on the other side. Until then, rest well. The story continues, and what a story it will be. Yet before we close this chapter completely, there are a few more threads worth weaving into our tapestry of Anne's early life. After all, understanding the foundation of a building helps us understand why it stands, or why it falls. And Anne Boleyn's foundation, laid in those childhood years at Hever, would prove both remarkably strong and fatally flawed. Let us consider, for instance, the question of temperament. What was young Anne actually like as a child? We have no diary entries, no letters from her childhood years, no first-hand accounts of her personality before she reached the courts of Europe. We are left to work backward from the woman she became, inferring the child from the adult, which is always a risky enterprise. People change. Circumstances shape us. The Anne who faced the scaffold at 35 was not the same person as the Anne who played in the gardens of Hever at 5. Still, certain traits seem to have been present from the beginning. Her intelligence, for one. Everyone who knew Anne in later life commented on her quick mind, her ability to grasp complex ideas, her talent for conversation and debate. Such intelligence does not appear from nowhere. It must have been evident even in childhood, in the way she approached her lessons, in the questions she asked, in the connections she made between disparate pieces of information. Her father certainly recognized her potential. Thomas Boleyn was not the sort of man to waste resources on a hopeless cause. The fact that he invested so heavily in Anne's education, that he secured her places at the most prestigious courts in Europe, suggests that he saw something special in her from an early age. Whether that something was raw intelligence, unusual beauty, remarkable charm, or some combination of all three, we cannot say for certain. But Thomas Boleyn saw it, and he cultivated it, and in the end his investment would yield returns beyond anything he could have dreamed, though not without costs that were equally unimaginable. Anne's temper was another trait that would become famous in later years. She was known for her sharp tongue, her willingness to speak her mind, her occasional flashes of rage when crossed. Kings and courtiers alike felt the sting of her wit when they displeased her. This tendency, too, must have had its origins in childhood, in a young girl who had not yet learned to fully suppress her natural responses, who had not yet mastered the art of diplomatic restraint that court life required. One can imagine the young Anne at Hever, arguing with her siblings, standing up to the servants, questioning her tutors with an intensity that was alternately charming and exhausting. Children who are that bright often have difficulty accepting authority, especially when they perceive that authority as arbitrary or unjust. Anne would have been learning during these early years when to push back and when to submit, lessons that would serve her well in some situations and disastrously in others. Her relationship with her sister Mary remained something of a mystery. Later in life, when both women were involved with Henry VIII, Mary as his mistress, Anne as his wife, there seems to have been tension between them. But what about earlier, when they were just two sisters growing up together at Hever? Were they close, as sisters sometimes are? Were they rivals, competing for their parents' attention and approval? Were they simply different, moving in parallel without much overlap in interests or affection? The evidence suggests that Mary and Anne were quite different in personality. Mary seems to have been softer, more compliant, more willing to go along with what was expected of her. She became Henry's mistress without demanding anything in return. No titles, no acknowledgement, no guarantee of security for herself or her children. Anne, by contrast, would hold out for marriage, would refuse to settle for less than the crown, would push and push until she got everything she wanted. These different approaches to life must have been evident even in childhood, in the way each sister responded to challenges and opportunities. George, the brother, occupies a peculiar place in the Boleyn family story. He was the son, the heir, the one on whom the family's long-term hopes were pinned. He was educated, talented, charming by all accounts. He rose high at court, earning positions of trust and responsibility. And in the end, he fell alongside his sister, executed on the same charges of treason and incest that brought Anne to the scaffold. The closeness between Anne and George would become a weapon in the hands of her enemies, twisted into accusations of unnatural intimacy that almost certainly had no basis in fact. But all of that was far in the future when the three Boleyn children were growing up together at Hever. Then, they were simply siblings, playing together, fighting together, learning together, growing together. The bonds formed in childhood would remain important throughout their lives, for better and for worse. George would be one of Anne's closest allies during her years as queen, and his execution would deprive her of one of her few remaining supporters at court. Let us also take a moment to consider what Anne could not have known during her childhood. The forces that were gathering beyond her awareness, the historical currents that would sweep her up and carry her toward her destiny. In Rome, the papacy was wrestling with challenges that would soon shake the foundations of Western Christianity. Church corruption was rampant, criticism was growing, and within a few years Martin Luther would nail his famous theses to the door of Wittenberg Cathedral, sparking a revolution that would divide Europe for centuries. The Reformation, when it came, would create the conditions that made Anne's rise possible, for without the break from Rome, Henry could never have divorced Catherine and married Anne. She would have remained an interesting but ultimately minor figure, not the queen who changed history. In Spain, Catherine of Aragon was already married to Henry VIII, already praying for the son she could not seem to produce, already worried about her inability to give her husband what he most wanted. Every miscarriage, every stillbirth, every dead infant was bringing Catherine closer to disaster, though she could not have known it yet. She was doing everything right, being a good wife, a devout Catholic, a supportive partner to her husband. But none of it would be enough to save her from the young woman growing up in Kent who would one day take her place. In France, King Francis I was preparing to create the most magnificent court in Europe, a centre of art and learning and pleasure that would attract the brightest minds and the most beautiful women from across the continent. This court would become Anne's finishing school, the place where she would learn everything she needed to know about charming kings and navigating political intrigue. Francis himself would take notice of young Anne, would appreciate her wit and her style, would dance with her at revels and converse with her at banquets. Years later, when she was Queen of England, their paths would cross again under very different circumstances. And in England, Henry VIII was still young and optimistic, still believing that everything would work out, still confident that Catherine would eventually give him the son he needed. He had no idea that his future wife was a child learning her letters in a country house in Kent. He had no idea that love, or what he would call love, would lead him to tear his kingdom apart, to execute 2 wives, to break with 1,000 years of religious tradition. He was simply the king, enjoying his court and his pleasures, waiting for the heir who would not come. All of these forces were moving, converging, building toward the moment when their paths would intersect. Anne knew nothing of any of it. She was just a child, living her childhood, absorbing her lessons, preparing for whatever future her father had planned for her. The irony of history is that those who change it most dramatically often do so without intention, carried along by currents they barely understand. Anne Boleyn did not set out to change history. She set out to survive and succeed in the world she had been born into, using the tools she had been given. That her survival and success would require the transformation of an entire nation's religion, the dissolution of an ancient institution, the redrawing of the European political map, these were consequences, not intentions. She could not have planned them because she could not have predicted them. No one could. And yet, looking back, it all seems somehow inevitable. The child at Hever, the woman at court, the queen on the throne, the prisoner in the tower, each stage seems to flow naturally from the one before, as if Anne were always destined to walk this particular path. This is an illusion, of course, the hindsight bias that makes us see purpose and design where there was only chance and choice. But it is a powerful illusion, and it helps explain why Anne's story continues to fascinate us half a millennium after her death. She was ordinary in so many ways, a child of her time, a product of her class, a woman constrained by the expectations of her society. And yet something set her apart, something that would catch the attention of a king and change the course of history. What was that something? Intelligence? Ambition? Charisma? Sexual attraction? Some combination of all these and more? We will probably never know for certain. The secret of Anne Boleyn's appeal died with her on that scaffold in May 1536. What we can know is where she came from, who made her, what foundation was laid in those early years. We can know that she was not a nobody who came from nowhere. We can know that she was educated and prepared and equipped for the world she would enter. We can know that her family was ambitious and climbing and saw in her an instrument for their advancement. We can know that she carried within her the potential for everything she would become, the good and the bad, the glory and the tragedy. The rest we must piece together from fragments and hints, from contemporary accounts and later interpretations, from the evidence that survived and the mysteries that remain. Anne Boleyn was born into a particular family at a particular time in a particular place. Everything that followed grew from those roots. Understanding the roots helps us understand the tree. And now, at last, this chapter truly draws to a close. We have explored Hever Castle, met the Boleyn family, traced Anne's origins and laid the groundwork for everything that is to come. The girl we have met in these pages is not yet the woman who will captivate a king, but she is recognizable as the beginning of that woman. The seeds have been planted. The foundation has been laid. Everything is in place for the next stage of the story. When we meet again, Anne will be crossing the English Channel, leaving childhood behind, entering the adult world of European courts. She will learn new skills, absorb new ideas, and begin the transformation that will make her one of the most famous women in English history. The stakes will rise, the drama will intensify, and the path toward both crown and scaffold will become clearer. Until then, rest easy. Let the story settle in your mind like wine in a cellar, deepening and developing as it waits. Dream of Tudor England if you like, its castles and its courts, its intrigues and its passions. Dream of a dark-eyed girl from Kent who had no idea what awaited her, but was somehow, in ways even she did not understand, preparing to meet it. And so we cross the English Channel at last, following young Anne Boleyn as she leaves the familiar comforts of Hever Castle behind and enters a world that will transform her utterly. The girl who boarded that ship in England was talented and well-bred, certainly, but she was still essentially a product of the English gentry, capable, educated, but not yet extraordinary. The woman who would eventually return was something else entirely. Sophisticated, worldly, French in manner and style, armed with skills and graces that would set her apart from every other woman at the English court. France, as it turned out, was very good at finishing what England had started. Anne's continental education began not in France itself, but in the Netherlands, at the court of Margaret of Austria. Margaret, as we mentioned earlier, was one of the most remarkable women of her age, a regent, a diplomat, a patron of the arts who had survived multiple widowhoods and emerged as one of the most powerful figures in European politics. Her court at Mechelen was a centre of culture and refinement, and the young ladies who served in her household received an education that money alone could not buy. Anne arrived there around 1513, probably at the age of 12 or thereabouts. She was young, even by the standards of the time, but Thomas Boleyn had worked hard to secure this position for his daughter, and he was not about to let a little thing like age stand in the way of opportunity. The fact that Margaret accepted her speaks well of Anne's early promise. The regent was not in the habit of taking on charity cases, and she expected the young women in her household to be genuinely accomplished. The months Anne spent with Margaret of Austria were brief but formative. She improved her French, learned the refined manners expected at continental courts, and absorbed lessons about how powerful women could operate in a world dominated by men. Margaret ruled the Netherlands with a firm hand, negotiating treaties, managing finances, and navigating the complex politics of the Habsburg family. She was proof that a woman could wield real power if she was clever enough and determined enough. Anne was watching and learning. But the Netherlands was only a preliminary stop. The real transformation would happen in France, where Anne would spend the next 9 years of her life, roughly a quarter of her entire existence on this earth. When she finally returned to England, she would be almost unrecognisable as the same person who had left. Anne's transfer to France came about through a twist of dynastic politics. In 1514, Henry VIII's younger sister Mary was dispatched across the Channel to marry King Louis XIII of France. It was a diplomatic match, designed to cement an alliance between England and France, and Mary Tudor was not particularly happy about it. Louis was old, sickly, and by all accounts not especially attractive. Mary, who was young and beautiful, had hoped for a more appealing husband. But princesses did not get to choose their spouses. That was rather the point of being a princess. And so off she went to France with a retinue of English ladies to attend her. Anne Boleyn was among those ladies. Whether she was specifically requested or simply included in the general shuffle of personnel, we don't know. But we do know that she crossed the Channel as part of Mary Tudor's entourage and found herself, at roughly 13 years of age, at one of the most sophisticated courts in Europe. The marriage of Mary Tudor and Louis XIV was mercifully brief. Louis died just 3 months after the wedding, officially from exhaustion, though the exact nature of that exhaustion has been the subject of much speculation over the centuries. Some have suggested that the elderly king simply could not keep up with his young bride's demands. Others argue that his health was already failing and the marriage merely hastened an inevitable end. Either way, Mary Tudor found herself a widow at 18, free to return to England and eventually marry the man she actually loved, Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk. Most of the English ladies who had accompanied Mary to France returned home with her. Anne Boleyn did not. Instead, through arrangements made by her well-connected father, she was transferred to the household of the new French queen, Claude, wife of the newly crowned Francis I. This was, if anything, an even more prestigious position than attending Mary Tudor had been. Claude was Queen of France, not merely the wife of an aging king, and her household was at the very centre of French court life. Queen Claude was a gentle, pious woman, devoted to her husband despite his constant infidelities. She spent much of her time pregnant. She would bear Francis 7 children in just 10 years of marriage before dying, worn out at the age of 24. Her household was known for its religious devotion and moral propriety, which might seem at odds with the later reputation Anne would acquire. But Claude's household was also cultured and refined, and the young women who served there learned the arts of gracious living at the highest level. Francis III, meanwhile, was everything that Louis XV had not been: young, vigorous, handsome, and absolutely devoted to pleasure in all its forms. He loved hunting and jousting, poetry and music, beautiful women and elegant conversation. His court was a perpetual festival of art and entertainment, drawing the finest minds and talents from across Europe. Leonardo da Vinci spent his final years in France at Francis's invitation, and the king collected Renaissance masterpieces the way other men collected hunting trophies. This was the world Anne Boleyn entered as a teenager, and it would shape her in ways that would last the rest of her life. She learned to speak French so perfectly that contemporaries would later remark that she seemed more French than English. She absorbed the latest fashions, the newest dances, the most sophisticated modes of conversation. She learned how to present herself, how to enter a room, how to catch and hold attention without appearing to try. She became, in short, exactly the kind of woman who could captivate a king. The French court valued wit and intelligence in women far more than the English court did. French ladies were expected to be able to hold their own in conversation, to appreciate poetry and music, to engage with ideas as well as gossip. This was a revelation for a young woman from England, where female accomplishments were more narrowly defined and female opinions more thoroughly suppressed. In France, Anne discovered that being clever could be an asset rather than a liability, that a quick tongue could attract admiration rather than censure. She also learned about love, or at least about the elaborate game of courtly love that French aristocrats played with such enthusiasm. This was a ritualized system of flirtation and pursuit, full of coded messages, symbolic gestures, and theatrical protestations of undying devotion. It bore about as much relationship to actual human emotion as professional wrestling bears to genuine combat. But it was tremendously entertaining, and provided endless opportunities for displaying one's wit and charm. Anne became adept at this game, learning how to encourage without committing, how to attract without surrendering, how to keep suitors interested without giving them what they wanted. These skills would prove invaluable later when the most powerful man in England began pursuing her. Anne's famous strategy with Henry VIII, holding out for marriage rather than settling for the position of mistress, has sometimes been attributed to unusual virtue or exceptional ambition. But it might also be seen as the natural application of lessons learned at the French court, where the chase was often more valued than the capture, and where a woman who surrendered too easily was considered barely worth having. 9 years is a long time, especially in one's formative years. Anne arrived in France as a child and left as a woman. She saw the French court at its most brilliant, witnessed the power struggles and romantic intrigues that swirled around Francis I, and learned how to navigate a world where appearance mattered as much as reality, and where a single misstep could mean social death. She also, quite possibly, began to develop the religious interests that would later make her such a controversial figure. The French court was a hotbed of religious debate in these years, with humanist scholars questioning traditional practices and evangelical ideas beginning to spread among the educated classes. Anne's sister-in-law, Marguerite of Navarre, was a patron of religious reformers and a woman of considerable intellectual ambition. Whether Anne came into direct contact with these circles or simply absorbed their influence through the general atmosphere of the court, we cannot say for certain. But the Anne who returned to England was interested in religious reform in a way that the Anne who left had not been. The exact date of Anne's return to England is uncertain, but it was probably around 1521 or 1522, when she would have been in her early 20s. Her father had arranged a marriage for her to an Irish nobleman named James Butler, a match that would have resolved a dispute over the Butler inheritance that had been dragging on for years. But the negotiations fell through for reasons that remain unclear, and Anne found herself back in England without a husband, looking for her next opportunity. That opportunity would come at the English court, where her French, Polish, and sophisticated manner would immediately set her apart from the other ladies. She was not the prettiest woman at court. Her sister Mary held that distinction, but she was arguably the most intriguing. Men found themselves drawn to her dark eyes and quick wit, her elegant French fashions, and her ability to hold conversation on topics that most English women barely knew existed. One of those men, eventually, would be the king himself. But that part of the story is still a few chapters away. For now, let us simply note that France made Anne Boleyn into the woman who would change English history. Without those 9 years of continental education, without the polish and the skills and the perspective she gained there, she might have lived and died as just another English gentlewoman, remembered by no one except her immediate descendants. France gave her the weapons she would need to conquer a king. Whether that was a blessing or a curse, well, that depends on how you look at it. Anne achieved more than almost any woman of her era could have dreamed of achieving. She also lost more than most women would ever have to lose. She was too educated, too opinionated, too unwilling to simply smile and nod and do what she was told. France had made her extraordinary. And extraordinary women in that time and place tended to come to extraordinary ends. But we've been focusing so much on Anne that we have neglected the other half of this story, the man without whom none of it would have happened. Henry VIII, King of England, supreme head of the church, and one of the most complicated figures in English history. To understand what happened between Henry and Anne, we need to understand Henry himself. And to do that, we need to look past the famous image of the bloated tyrant in his final years and recover the young man he once was. Because here's the thing about Henry VIII that people often forget. He wasn't always a monster. In fact, for most of his life he was considered one of the most attractive and accomplished princes in Europe. The transformation from golden boy to murderous despot happened gradually, over decades, and understanding that transformation is essential to understanding everything that followed. When Henry came to the throne in 1509, he was just 17 years old, young, handsome, athletic, and bursting with energy and ambition. Contemporary descriptions paint a picture of a Renaissance prince straight out of central casting. Tall, well-built, with reddish gold hair and a fair complexion, skilled in all the manly arts of war and sport, yet also cultivated enough to compose music, write poetry, and engage in theological debate. He could ride, hunt, joust, wrestle, and dance better than almost anyone at his court. He spoke several languages fluently. He was charming, generous, and seemingly genuinely interested in the welfare of his subjects. Unsurprisingly, everyone loved him. After the cold, calculating reign of his father Henry VII, who had been more interested in filling the royal treasury than in entertaining the nobility, the young Henry VIII seemed like a breath of fresh air. He threw parties and tournaments, distributed lavish gifts, and generally behaved like a king should behave, or at least like people thought a king should behave. The early years of his reign were a kind of extended celebration, a national party with the young king as host and star attraction. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon seemed to complete the picture perfectly. Catherine was a Spanish princess of impeccable lineage, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, those famous monarchs who had united Spain and sponsored Columbus's voyages to the New World. She was intelligent, dignified, deeply pious, and devoted to her young husband. Henry, by all accounts, was equally devoted to her in those early years. They shared intellectual interests, religious values, and what appears to have been genuine affection. It was, as royal marriages went, a genuine love match. The only problem, and it was a significant problem, was the question of children. Catherine conceived repeatedly during the early years of the marriage, but the pregnancies ended badly with depressing regularity. Miscarriages, stillbirths, infants who lived only hours or days. The royal nursery remained stubbornly empty no matter how hard Catherine tried. In 1516 she finally delivered a healthy child who survived, a daughter named Mary. Henry was pleased, but a daughter was not what he needed. A daughter could not secure the succession, could not guarantee that the Tudor dynasty would continue, could not prevent the kingdom from descending into civil war after Henry's death. We need to pause here and understand just how important this issue was to Henry and to everyone around him. The Tudor dynasty was new and fragile, having come to power only through victory and battle. Henry VII had won his crown at Bosworth Field, defeating Richard III in 1485, but his claim to the throne was tenuous at best. He was descended from the illegitimate line of John of Gaunt, hardly a ringing endorsement of royal legitimacy. The Wars of the Roses, that bloody conflict between York and Lancaster that had torn England apart for decades, were still within living memory. Everyone knew what happened when the succession was unclear. Civil war, chaos, death on a massive scale. Henry needed a son. Not just wanted, needed. The stability of the realm, the peace of the kingdom, the very future of England depended on him producing a male heir who could take the throne after his death and continue the Tudor line. This was not paranoia or obsession, it was political reality. And as the years passed and Catherine failed to produce that son, Henry's desperation grew. By the mid-1520s, when Anne Boleyn was catching his eye, Henry was no longer the carefree young king of his early reign. He was approaching middle age, still vigorous but aware that time was passing. Catherine was older still, and her childbearing years were clearly behind her. The chance of her producing a male heir was essentially zero. Henry was stuck with a wife who could not give him what he needed, and no amount of prayer or medical intervention was going to change that. It's tempting from our modern perspective to see Henry's fixation on a male heir as mere sexism, as if he could not accept the idea of a woman ruling England and therefore condemned his wife for failing to produce a boy. There's probably some truth to that. Henry was a man of his time, and his time did not believe women were capable of ruling kingdoms effectively. But there was also a practical dimension to his concern. England had never had a ruling queen. The one time a woman had claimed the throne, Matilda in the 12th century, it had led to nearly 20 years of civil war. Henry had every reason to believe that naming his daughter Mary as his heir would lead to disaster. So he prayed for a son. He went on pilgrimages, made offerings to saints, tried every remedy suggested by his physicians and advisers. Nothing worked. Catherine continued to age, her health declining, her fertility long since exhausted. Henry was trapped in a marriage that could not give him what he needed, and he could see no way out. And then Anne Boleyn appeared. But before we get to that fateful meeting, let us spend a moment longer with Henry himself, because understanding his psychology is crucial to understanding everything that followed. Henry was not simply a lustful king who wanted a new wife because he was bored with the old one. He was a man in genuine crisis, caught between his religious beliefs, his political necessities, and his personal desires. Henry was, by the standards of his time, genuinely religious. He attended Mass daily, went to confession regularly, and took his role as a Christian king seriously. In 1521, he had even written a book defending Catholic doctrine against Martin Luther's attacks, a book that earned him the title Defender of the Faith from a grateful Pope. This was not the action of a man who took religion lightly. Henry believed in God, believed in the Church, and believed that his actions had consequences for his immortal soul. This religious conviction would prove crucial when he began to question his marriage to Catherine. Henry didn't simply want a divorce because he was tired of his wife and attracted to another woman, or at least that's not how he framed it to himself. He convinced himself that his marriage to Catherine had been sinful from the start, that God was punishing him for wedding his brother's widow, and that the only way to restore divine favour was to end the marriage and start fresh. Whether he genuinely believed this or simply rationalised his desires with theological arguments is a question scholars have debated for centuries. Probably a bit of both, but we're getting ahead of ourselves again. The point is that Henry, by the time Anne entered his life, was already a man under tremendous pressure. Pressure to secure the succession, pressure to satisfy his conscience, pressure to find some solution to a problem that seemed to have no solution. He was still outwardly the Golden King, still jousting and dancing and presiding over his glittering court. But inside he was increasingly desperate. This desperation would eventually transform him. The charming young prince of the early reign would become, by the end of his life, a bloated and paranoid tyrant, capable of sending wives and friends and advisers to their deaths with barely a second thought. The road from one to the other led directly through his relationship with Anne Boleyn and the religious revolution it required. Anne didn't create the monster Henry became. That would be giving her too much credit or too much blame. But she was the catalyst that set everything in motion. Now we come to the heart of the matter, the theological argument that would provide Henry with his justification for ending his marriage to Catherine, and eventually breaking England away from the Catholic Church entirely. It's a complicated bit of biblical interpretation, and frankly it requires us to enter a mindset very different from our own. But without understanding this argument, we cannot understand why Henry did what he did, or why so many people at the time took his side. The argument centered on a passage from the book of Leviticus, chapter 20, verse 21. If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. He hath uncovered his brother's nakedness. They shall be childless. There it was, in black and white, right in the Bible. If a man married his brother's widow, the marriage would be cursed with childlessness. And Catherine, as we know, had been married to Henry's older brother Arthur before becoming Henry's wife. Arthur had died young, just months after the wedding, and Henry had married his widow with a special dispensation from the Pope that was supposed to overcome the biblical prohibition. But what if that dispensation had been invalid? What if no pope had the authority to set aside God's explicit command? What if the marriage had been sinful from the start and all those dead babies and failed pregnancies were God's punishment for that sin? This was Henry's argument, and to him it made perfect sense. Look at the evidence. He had been married to Catherine for nearly 20 years, and she had not given him a living son. The biblical text predicted exactly this outcome for men who married their brothers' widows. Ergo, his marriage must be cursed. The Pope had exceeded his authority in granting the dispensation. The only solution was to have the marriage declared null and void, freeing Henry to marry again, and hopefully produce the male heir England so desperately needed. Now, there were some problems with this argument, as Catherine and her supporters were quick to point out. For one thing, there was another biblical passage, Deuteronomy 25:5, that actually commanded men to marry their brothers' widows under certain circumstances, specifically when the brother had died without children. This seemed to directly contradict the Leviticus passage, or at least to suggest that the prohibition was not absolute. How could the Bible both forbid and command the same action? For another thing, Catherine insisted that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. She and Arthur had been young. She was 15, he was 15, and Arthur had been sickly. They had shared a bed for a few months before his death, but Catherine swore on her immortal soul that they had never actually had sexual relations. If that was true, then she had never really been Arthur's wife in the full biblical sense, and the Leviticus prohibition did not apply. Catherine maintained this position until her dying day, and most historians are inclined to believe her. She was a devout Catholic who took her oath seriously, and she had nothing to gain by lying about something that could easily be checked. The wedding night sheets, for instance, had been preserved and examined, and they showed no evidence of consummation. But Henry chose not to believe her, or at least chose to act as if he didn't believe her. He needed the Leviticus argument to work, and so he insisted that Catherine was lying about her relationship with Arthur. The theological debate that followed consumed the courts and universities of Europe for years. Scholars were recruited to argue both sides, with prestigious institutions like Oxford and Cambridge lending their authority to Henry's position, while continental universities tended to support Catherine. The Pope, Clement VII, was caught in an impossible position. He wanted to accommodate Henry, who was a valuable ally, but he could not simply overturn a dispensation issued by one of his predecessors without undermining papal authority itself. And there was another complication. Catherine's nephew was Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, whose armies happened to be occupying Rome at the time. Clement was, quite literally, Charles's prisoner, and in no position to rule against Charles's aunt. The case dragged on for years, with no resolution in sight. Henry grew increasingly frustrated. He had expected the Pope to grant his annulment quickly and quietly, as popes had done for other monarchs in similar situations. Instead, he found himself entangled in a web of theological argument and political calculation from which there seemed to be no escape. It was during these years of frustration and waiting that Anne Boleyn became more than just a potential replacement wife. She became a symbol of everything Henry wanted and could not have: youth, fertility, a fresh start, freedom from a marriage that felt increasingly like a prison. Every year that passed without resolution was another year wasted, another year closer to the grave without the son he needed. Henry's desperation grew, and with it, his willingness to consider increasingly radical solutions. Those solutions would eventually include breaking with Rome entirely, declaring himself supreme head of the Church of England, and taking the power to grant his own annulment. But that was still in the future. For now, Henry clung to the hope that the Pope would see reason, that the theological argument would win the day, that he could have what he wanted without tearing apart the religious fabric of Western Christendom. He was wrong about that, of course. But he didn't know it yet. What Henry did know was that his marriage to Catherine was cursed. Cursed by God according to the book of Leviticus, cursed by the evidence of all those dead children, cursed by the absence of the son he needed so desperately. Whether this conviction was genuine religious belief or convenient rationalization, it gave him the justification he needed to pursue Anne with a clear conscience. He wasn't abandoning a faithful wife for a younger woman. He was correcting a mistake, ending a sinful union, seeking to restore himself to God's favour. Catherine, of course, saw things very differently. She had been a good wife for nearly 20 years. She had borne Henry's children. Not all of them had survived, but that was hardly her fault. She had supported him, counselled him, loved him with a devotion that never wavered even as his affection for her faded. And now she was being told that their entire marriage had been a lie, that she had been living in sin, that her daughter Mary was illegitimate. She refused to accept it. She would never accept it. She would go to her grave insisting that she was Henry's true wife and rightful queen. The collision between Henry's theological conviction and Catherine's principled resistance would produce one of the great dramas of the Tudor age. It would end with England breaking away from Rome, with Catherine banished from court and forbidden to see her daughter, with Thomas More and other principled men losing their heads for refusing to acknowledge Henry's new marriage. And at the centre of it all, Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom all of this was happening, the prize that justified the revolutionary changes Henry was prepared to make. Anne must have watched these developments with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. She was getting what she wanted: the king's devotion, the promise of marriage, the prospect of becoming queen. But the price was proving higher than anyone had anticipated, and the obstacles more formidable. Every year the case dragged on was another year of her youth spent waiting, Another year of her reputation being shredded by those who called her a whore and a homewrecker. Another year of uncertainty about whether any of it would actually come to pass. Still, she held firm. She had come too far to give up now. And Henry, trapped between his desperate need for a son and his conviction that his first marriage had been sinful, had no choice but to keep pushing forward. The die was cast. The wheels were in motion. The religious revolution that would transform England was gathering momentum. And so we leave this chapter with all the pieces in place for the drama that is about to unfold. Anne, back from France and dazzling the English court with her continental sophistication. Henry, desperate for a son and convinced that his marriage to Catherine is cursed. Catherine, determined to defend her position as rightful queen no matter the cost. And behind the time that Anne had written about in her prayer book was indeed coming. It was almost here. The collision that would change everything was just around the corner. Rest now, and we'll continue the story soon. There is so much more to tell: the courtship, the secret marriage, the coronation, and yes, eventually the fall. But those chapters can wait for another night. For now, let the foundations we've laid settle into your mind. Let the characters we've met, Anne, Henry, Catherine, take shape in your imagination. Let the theological arguments and political calculations fade into a general sense of the forces at work. The story is building toward its climax. The greatest drama of the Tudor age is about to begin in earnest. Sleep well. The time will come. But before you drift off entirely, let us add a few more brushstrokes to the portrait we've been painting. There are details worth dwelling on, nuances worth exploring, aspects of this story that deserve a bit more attention before we move on to the next chapter. Consider, for instance, the physical reality of Henry VIII in his prime. Not the bloated figure of the later portraits, but the athletic young king who made hearts flutter across Europe. He stood over 6 feet tall at a time when the average man barely reached 5.5 feet. This alone would have made him impressive, towering over most of his courtiers, dominating any room he entered simply by virtue of his height. Add to this a powerful build kept in peak condition through constant hunting, jousting and tennis. Yes, tennis, which Henry played with an enthusiasm that exhausted his opponents, and you have a figure of genuinely imposing physical presence. His face in the early portraits was handsome in a robust, energetic way. The reddish-gold hair that Catherine apparently found attractive, the fair complexion, the piercing eyes that observers described as alternately charming and intimidating. He had what we might today call charisma, that indefinable quality that makes people want to follow someone, to please them, to bask in their approval. When Henry turned his full attention on you by all accounts, it was like standing in a spotlight. You felt special, chosen, blessed by the royal notice. This charisma extended to his intellectual pursuits as well. Henry was genuinely learned, not merely playing at scholarship the way some aristocrats did. He composed music that was good enough to survive and be performed today, including possibly the famous Greensleeves, though that attribution is disputed. He wrote poetry, engaged in theological debate, corresponded with the leading humanist scholars of his age. He was fluent in Latin, French and Spanish, and he took his role as a Renaissance prince seriously. It's important to hold on to this image of the young Henry, because it helps explain why people were willing to follow him into such dangerous territory. This was not some obviously unhinged tyrant demanding that everyone go along with his delusions. This was a popular, admired, respected king whose judgment people had learned to trust over decades of apparently successful rule. When he said his marriage was invalid, many of his subjects were inclined to believe him, or at least to give him the benefit of the doubt. When he said the Pope had overstepped his authority, there were plenty of Englishmen who had long harboured suspicions about Roman interference in English affairs, and were happy to see the king stand up for national sovereignty. The transformation from this golden figure to the monster of the later reign was gradual enough that people could tell themselves, at each step, that nothing fundamental had changed. Each execution could be justified as necessary for the security of the realm. Each religious reform could be presented as a return to biblical purity rather than a revolutionary break with tradition. Each increasingly arbitrary act of royal will could be explained away as the response of a beleaguered king facing treacherous enemies on all sides. By the time it became clear just how far Henry had fallen, by the time the bodies had piled up high enough that no one could ignore them, it was too late to do anything about it. The machinery of royal absolutism had been constructed, and anyone who tried to stand in its way found themselves swept under its wheels. But all of that was still in the future during the years we've been discussing. In the mid-1520s, Henry was still the Golden King, still beloved by most of his subjects, still capable of inspiring loyalty and affection as well as fear. His pursuit of Anne Boleyn was seen by many as romantic rather than predatory. A king swept off his feet by love, willing to move heaven and earth to be with the woman who had captured his heart. The darker interpretation would only emerge later, with the benefit of hindsight. Let us also spend a moment more with Catherine of Aragon, whose perspective is often overshadowed by the drama surrounding Anne. Catherine was not simply a passive victim in this story. She was a formidable woman in her own right, with her own convictions, her own strategies, and her own determination to fight for what she believed was rightfully hers. She had been born a princess of Spain, daughter of the legendary Isabella and Ferdinand, raised in a court that had just completed the centuries-long Reconquista and expelled both Moors and Jews from Spanish territory. She had been trained from childhood for a life of royal duty, educated in the classics, and imbued with a sense of her own dignity and worth that no amount of royal displeasure could shake. When she arrived in England at the age of 16 to marry Prince Arthur, she carried with her the expectations of two great kingdoms and the weight of a dynastic alliance that had been years in the making. Arthur's death left her in an impossible position. A widow in a foreign country, her future uncertain, her value as a diplomatic asset rapidly declining. She spent years in a kind of limbo, neither wife nor maid nor properly settled, while her father and father-in-law haggled over her dowry and debated what to do with her. The marriage, and she had tried so hard to fulfill that destiny. Pregnancy after pregnancy, each one carrying the hope that this time finally there would be a living son. Each failure must have been devastating, not just personally but dynastically. She knew as well as anyone how desperately Henry needed an heir, and she knew that her inability to provide one was undermining her position. She prayed, she made pilgrimages, she did everything the medical wisdom of the age suggested might help. Nothing worked. By the time Anne Boleyn entered the picture, Catherine was in her early 40s, old by 16th century standards, her childbearing years definitively behind her. She knew she would never give Henry the son he wanted, but she refused to accept that this meant her marriage was invalid, that her daughter was illegitimate, that everything she had worked for and suffered through meant nothing. She would fight for her position, for her daughter's rights, for the principle that a marriage blessed by the Church could not simply be discarded when it became inconvenient. Her resistance was not merely personal stubbornness. It was a principled stand based on deeply held religious convictions. Catherine believed that her marriage to Henry was valid in the eyes of God, that no earthly power could dissolve it, and that accepting an annulment would be accepting a lie. She was prepared to suffer any consequences rather than compromise on this point, and suffer she did. Banished from court, separated from her daughter, stripped of her title, forced to live in increasingly uncomfortable accommodations while her health declined. She never gave in. Even on her deathbed, she signed her last letter to Henry as Catherine the Queen. It was a final act of defiance from a woman who had spent her entire life being told what she could and could not do, and who had ultimately discovered that there were some things she simply would not accept, no matter who commanded her. The triangle formed by Henry, Catherine, and Anne is one of the great dramas of English history, and it's worth understanding all three perspectives if we're to make sense of what happened. Henry, convinced that his marriage was cursed and desperate for a way out. Catherine, determined to defend her position and her daughter's rights regardless of the cost. And Anne, waiting in the wings, holding out for the ultimate prize while the two titans battled over her fate. None of them could have known how it would end. Henry thought he would get his annulment, marry Anne, have a son, and live happily ever after. Catherine thought the Pope would rule in her favour, Henry would come to his senses, and everything would return to normal. Anne thought she would become queen, produce a male heir, and secure her position forever. They were all wrong. History had something much more complicated in store for all three of them. But that's a story for the chapters ahead. For now, let these three figures settle into your imagination. The desperate king, the defiant queen, the ambitious challenger waiting for her moment. Let the theological arguments fade into background noise, leaving only the human drama at the centre. Love and ambition, faith and politics, hope and despair all tangled together in ways that no one at the time could fully unravel. The time was coming. For Anne, it would bring triumph followed by tragedy. For Henry, it would bring the son he so desperately wanted, though not from Anne, and a transformation into something he would hardly have recognised in his youth. For Catherine, it would bring only suffering, vindication coming too late to matter, death in exile still insisting on her rights. Three lives, intertwined by fate and circumstance heading toward collision. The impact would reshape England, transform Christianity, and echo down through the centuries to our own time. Rest now. We have laid the foundations. The building is about to rise. The story continues. And yet there is one more thread worth weaving into this tapestry before we lay it aside, the question of what might have been. History is full of turning points, moments where things could have gone differently, and the story of Henry and Anne is no exception. What if Catherine had given Henry a son early in their marriage? The entire course of English history might have changed. There would have been no desperate search for an annulment, no break with Rome, no Anglican church, no dissolution of the monasteries. Anne Boleyn might have lived out her life as a minor court figure, perhaps married off to some nobleman and forgotten by history. Henry might have remained the golden king of his youth, never transformed by frustration and desperation into the tyrant of his later years. England might have remained Catholic, tied to Rome, part of the great community of Western Christendom. But Catherine did not give Henry a son. And so here we are, contemplating one of the great what-ifs of history, knowing that it didn't happen, that the path actually taken led where it led, that Anne Boleyn became queen and then lost her head, and that nothing can change any of it now. That's the thing about history, isn't it? It feels inevitable in retrospect, as if things could only have happened the way they did. But in the moment, nothing is inevitable. Everything hangs in the balance. Every decision opens some doors and closes others. The people living through historical events don't know they're living through historical events. They're just living, making the best choices they can with the information they have, hoping things will work out. Henry didn't know he was about to break England away from Rome. Catherine didn't know she was about to be displaced by a woman she considered her social inferior. Anne didn't know she was about to become the most controversial figure in English history. They were all just people, doing what people do, following their desires and their convictions and their ambitions toward destinations they couldn't see. That's what makes this story so compelling, even after 500 years. It's not just about kings and queens and religious revolutions. It's about human beings making choices that would echo through centuries, not knowing what they were setting in motion, unable to foresee the consequences of their actions. We are the same. Every day we make choices whose consequences we cannot predict. Every decision opens some doors and closes others. We navigate our lives the best we can, guided by our values and our desires, hoping things will work out, knowing they might not. In that sense, Henry and Catherine and Anne are not so different from us. They were just playing for higher stakes. And on that note, let us truly bring this chapter to a close. We have covered much ground: Anne's transformation in France, Henry's desperation for an heir, the theological arguments that would be used to justify everything that followed. We have met our characters in their complexity, seen them as human beings rather than mere figures in a historical pageant. The next chapter will bring them together at last, Anne and Henry face to face at the English court, beginning the relationship that would change everything. We will see how the king fell in love, how the courtier held out for marriage, how the collision between royal desire and religious principle set England on a revolutionary course. And so Anne Boleyn returned to England sometime around 1521 or 1522, transformed by her years on the continent into something the English court had never quite seen before. She was in her early 20s now, no longer the child who had left for the Netherlands nearly a decade earlier, but a sophisticated woman of the world, fluent in French, skilled in all the arts of courtly life, and possessed of a certain indefinable quality that made people pay attention when she entered a room. The position waiting for her was respectable but not remarkable, lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Yes, you heard that correctly. Anne's first role at the English court was serving the very woman she would eventually replace. There's a certain dark irony in that arrangement, isn't there? Every morning Anne would help dress the Queen, attend her at meals, accompany her to chapel, and generally perform all the duties expected of a well-born young woman in service to royalty. And every evening, presumably, she would retire to her own quarters and perhaps wonder what the future held for her, never imagining, surely, that she would one day take Catherine's place in the king's bed and on the throne of England. The English court Anne entered was glittering but treacherous, a place where careers could be made or destroyed on the basis of a single word, where today's favourite could be tomorrow's exile, where everyone was watching everyone else for signs of weakness or opportunity. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of environment Anne had been trained for during her years in France. She knew how to navigate these waters. She knew how to attract attention without appearing to try. She knew how to play the game, and play it she did. Within months of her arrival, Anne had established herself as one of the most intriguing figures at court. She wasn't the most beautiful woman there. That honour probably belonged to her sister Mary, who had already caught the king's eye and become his mistress. But Anne had something that beauty alone could not provide. She was interesting. Her conversations sparkled with the wit and sophistication she had acquired in France. Her fashion sense was ahead of anything English ladies were wearing. Her dancing was exquisite, her musical abilities impressive, her entire manner suggesting a world of culture and refinement that most English courtiers could only imagine. Men noticed her. Of course they did. That was rather the point. Anne was at court to find a husband to make an advantageous match that would benefit both herself and her family. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, ever the schemer, had positioned her carefully, and Anne was doing her part by being noticed by the right people. The first serious suitor we know about was Henry Percy, eldest son and heir of the Earl of Northumberland. Percy was young, handsome, and besotted with Anne, exactly the sort of match the Boleyns might have hoped for. The two apparently fell in love, or at least fell into something that felt like love at the time, and there was talk of a secret engagement. Some historians have suggested they may even have exchanged vows, which would have constituted a binding pre-contract of marriage under the laws of the time. But Cardinal Wolsey put a stop to it. Wolsey was Henry VIII's chief minister, the most powerful man in England after the king himself, and he had other plans for young Percy, specifically a marriage to Mary Talbot that would serve Wolsey's political interests. When he learned of Percy's entanglement with Anne Boleyn, he summoned the young man and gave him what must have been a thoroughly unpleasant dressing down. Percy was reminded of his duties to his family, his obligations to his future position, and the complete unsuitability of a match with a mere knight's daughter, however charming she might be. Percy, he always did. He was not a man of particularly strong character, and standing up to the formidable Wolsey was beyond his capabilities. The engagement, such as it was broken off. Percy went on to marry Mary Talbot as commanded, in what would prove to be a spectacularly unhappy union, and Anne was left with a broken heart and perhaps a grudge against Cardinal Wolsey that would eventually contribute to his downfall. But here's where the story gets interesting. There's a persistent rumour, never definitively proven but never entirely disproven either, that the real reason Wolsey broke up the Percy match was not politics but something far more personal. The rumour suggests that Henry VIII himself had already noticed Anne Boleyn, had already begun to conceive a desire for her, and had instructed Wolsey to remove Percy from the picture. If this is true, then Henry's pursuit of Anne began earlier than most historians have assumed, and the king was already clearing the field of competitors before making his own move. Whether or not the rumour is accurate, we know for certain that by 1526 or so, Henry's interest in Anne had become unmistakable. He began paying her special attention at court, dancing with her, conversing with her, seeking out her company in ways that set tongues wagging throughout the palace. Anne, for her part, seems to have responded to this attention with a mixture of encouragement and resistance that drove Henry to distraction. Here we must pause to consider a crucial question. What exactly was Anne's strategy? Some historians have portrayed her as a calculating schemer who deliberately set out to ensnare the king from the moment she arrived at court. Others have seen her as an innocent victim of royal lust, swept up in forces beyond her control. The truth, as usual, probably lies somewhere in between. Anne certainly knew how to play the game of courtly love. She had learned it in France, where such games were practically an art form. She knew that a woman who surrendered too easily was considered worthless, while a woman who held out could drive her suitor to ever greater displays of devotion. She knew that the chase was often more exciting than the capture, and that a man who had to work for what he wanted would value it more highly than something given freely. But Anne was also genuinely ambitious, and she had seen what happened to women who became royal mistresses. Her own sister Mary had travelled that path, warming the king's bed for several years before being discarded when Henry's interest waned. Mary had gotten nothing lasting from the affair. No titles, no wealth, no security for her future. She had been used and set aside, her reputation compromised, her prospects diminished. Anne had no intention of following the same path. So when Henry began his pursuit in earnest, Anne did something unprecedented. She said no. Not no to everything. She was willing to flirt, to dance, to accept gifts, to engage in the elaborate rituals of courtly love. But no to the one thing Henry actually wanted, which was to take her to bed. She would not become his mistress. She would not surrender her virtue for anything less than marriage. This must have been absolutely maddening for Henry. He was the King of England, accustomed to getting whatever he wanted whenever he wanted it. Women did not say no to him, it simply wasn't done. And yet here was Anne Boleyn, a mere knight's daughter, refusing him again and again, always charming, always enticing, but always stopping short of the ultimate surrender. The love letters Henry wrote to Anne during this period are among the most remarkable documents to survive from the Tudor age. They reveal a man completely besotted, desperate for any scrap of affection, reduced to begging and pleading in terms that seem almost pathetic coming from a king. "I beseech you now with all my heart definitely to let me know your whole mind as to the love between us," he wrote in one letter. In another, "If it pleases you to do the duty of a true loyal mistress and friend, and to give yourself body and heart to me, I will take you as my sole mistress, casting off all others than yourself out of mind and affection." Note that phrase, sole mistress. Henry was offering Anne exclusivity, promising to give up all other women if she would only yield to him. This was a significant concession from a king who was accustomed to taking lovers whenever he pleased. But it still wasn't enough. Anne wanted more than to be a mistress, even a sole one. She wanted to be a wife. The exact moment when Anne raised the stakes from mistress to queen is impossible to pinpoint, but at some point the nature of their negotiations shifted fundamentally. Henry went from asking Anne to be his lover to asking her to be his wife, and Anne apparently agreed. But there was a problem. A rather significant problem, actually. Henry already had a wife, and this is where the theological arguments we discussed earlier become not just intellectual exercises but urgent practical necessities. Henry needed an annulment. He needed the Pope to declare that his marriage to Catherine had never been valid. He needed to be free to marry Anne and hopefully to produce the male heir he so desperately wanted. The love affair had become entangled with the succession crisis, and both were about to become entangled with a religious revolution that would change England forever. The years between 1527 and 1532 were a prolonged agony of waiting, negotiating, hoping, and despairing. Henry's great matter, as the annulment case came to be called, consumed enormous resources of time, money, and political capital. Ambassadors were dispatched to Rome. Universities were canvassed for opinions. Theologians were recruited to argue the king's case. And through it all, Anne waited, growing older, her reputation increasingly compromised by her association with the king, her enemies multiplying as it became clear that she posed a genuine threat to the established order. She was not passive during this waiting period. Anne cultivated allies, promoted her family's interests, and positioned herself as closely as possible to the levers of power. She accompanied Henry on state occasions, sat beside him at banquets, received visiting dignitaries as if she were already queen. Catherine, meanwhile, was increasingly marginalised, pushed to the edges of court life. Her position eroded month by month, even as she continued to insist that she was the king's true wife. The gifts Henry showered on Anne during these years were extraordinary in their extravagance. Jewels, lands, titles, everything that royal favour could provide. In 1532, he created her Marquess of Pembroke in her own right, an almost unprecedented honour for a woman. This title came with substantial lands and income, ensuring that Anne would be wealthy and powerful regardless of what happened next. It was also perhaps a signal to the Pope and the world that Henry was serious about making Anne his queen, whether Rome approved or not. The symbolic gifts were perhaps even more significant than the material ones. Henry gave Anne a book of hours, a prayer book, with a miniature portrait of himself inside it. He gave her jewellery featuring their intertwined initials. He commissioned portraits that showed them together, presented as a couple, a king and his future queen. Every gift was a statement of intent, a declaration that Anne was not merely a passing fancy, but the woman Henry intended to spend his life with. For her part, Anne gave Henry something that would prove far more consequential than any jewel or portrait. She gave him a book. Specifically, she gave him a copy of William Tyndale's The Obedience of a Christian Man, a religious treatise that would fundamentally reshape how Henry thought about his own power and his relationship with the church. But that gift, and its revolutionary implications, deserves its own chapter. The book Anne Boleyn placed in Henry VIII's hands was, on its surface, a work of Protestant theology, the kind of text that was officially banned in England and could get you burned at the stake if you were caught reading it. William Tyndale was a wanted man, a heretic in the eyes of the Catholic Church, currently hiding somewhere on the continent and producing English translations of the Bible that church authorities considered dangerous and subversive. His Obedience of a Christian Man argued for ideas that the established religious order found deeply threatening, and yet Anne gave it to Henry, and Henry read it. And when he finished reading, he reportedly said something along the lines of, "This is a book for me and all kings to read." What was so appealing about Tyndale's argument? In essence, he argued that temporal rulers, kings, princes, secular authorities, derived their power directly from God, without any need for mediation by the Church. The Pope, in Tyndale's view, had no legitimate authority to tell Christian kings what to do. Kings were answerable to God alone, not to Rome. The clergy should concern themselves with spiritual matters and leave the governance of nations to those whom God had appointed for that purpose. You can see immediately why Henry found this argument attractive. Here was theological justification for everything he wanted to do but had been told he couldn't. If Tyndale was right, then the Pope had no business refusing Henry's annulment. If kings derived their authority directly from God, then Henry could declare his own marriage invalid without needing anyone's permission. The book didn't just comfort Henry's conscience, it armed him with a revolutionary theory of royal supremacy that would reshape the relationship between church and state in England. Now, we should be careful here not to give Anne too much credit or too much blame, depending on your perspective, for what followed. Henry didn't break with Rome simply because Anne gave him a book. The causes of the English Reformation were complex, involving theological disputes, political calculations, economic interests, and genuine religious conviction all tangled together in ways that historians still debate. Anne was a catalyst, not a cause. But she was an important catalyst. Anne was genuinely interested in religious reform, having absorbed evangelical ideas during her years in France. She patronized reformist clergy, promoted the circulation of English Bibles, and used her influence with Henry to advance the careers of men who shared her religious views. Whether her faith was sincere or merely useful to her political agenda is a question we cannot definitively answer, but her actions suggest someone who took religious matters seriously and believed that the Church was in need of fundamental change. Henry's path to breaking with Rome was gradual rather than sudden. First came the attempts to get what he wanted through normal channels, petitioning the Pope, arguing the theological case, applying diplomatic pressure. When these efforts failed, Henry began to explore more radical options. What if Parliament could simply declare the king's marriage invalid? What if the English clergy could rule on the annulment without reference to Rome? What if the Pope's authority in England could be abolished altogether? Each step seemed reasonable enough in isolation. Each step led to the next. And by the time anyone fully realised what was happening, England had embarked on a religious revolution that would transform the country forever. The key legislation came between 1532 and 1534. The Act in Restraint of Appeals declared that England was an empire, a legal term meaning a sovereign state that recognised no superior authority, and that English ecclesiastical courts could make final decisions on matters like marriage without appeal to Rome. The Act of Supremacy declared Henry to be the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England, formally transferring papal authority to the crown. The Act of Succession declared Henry's marriage to Catherine void and made any children born to Anne legitimate heirs to the throne. These were revolutionary changes, implemented through the machinery of Parliament with a speed that must have left many observers breathless. The England that emerged from this legislative whirlwind was fundamentally different from the England that had existed before. The Pope's authority was gone. The king was now head of the Church. Anyone who refused to acknowledge these changes, like Thomas More, the former Lord Chancellor, faced imprisonment and death. Anne watched these developments with what must have been a mixture of triumph and trepidation. Everything was going her way. Henry was clearing the path to their marriage with the ruthless efficiency he brought to everything he truly wanted. The obstacles that had seemed insurmountable were being swept aside one by one, and yet the cost was becoming clearer with each passing month. People were dying for refusing to accept the new order. The kingdom was being torn apart, and Anne herself was becoming the most hated woman in England, blamed by Catherine's supporters for destroying a royal marriage, blamed by religious conservatives for leading the king into heresy, blamed by practically everyone for the upheaval that was disrupting their lives. The secret marriage finally took place in January 1533, while Catherine was still technically queen and before the formal annulment had been pronounced. It was a quiet ceremony, attended by only a handful of witnesses, conducted in circumstances that suggested haste and perhaps anxiety. Henry and Anne had waited so long for this moment, had endured so much to reach it. And now, finally, they were husband and wife, in secret at least, though the secret would not remain one for long. Anne was already pregnant when they married. This was either very good planning or a remarkable coincidence, depending on how you interpret the evidence. Henry had waited 7 years for Anne, 7 years of frustrated desire and mounting desperation. The fact that she conceived almost immediately after their secret marriage suggests either that she had calculated the timing precisely, or that years of tension had finally been released with predictable biological consequences. Either way, the pregnancy added urgency to everything that followed. If Anne was carrying a son, and everyone assumed she was carrying a son, then that son needed to be born legitimate, which meant the marriage needed to be made public and official as quickly as possible. The annulment of Henry's marriage to Catherine was formally pronounced in May 1533 by Thomas Cranmer, the newly appointed Archbishop of Canterbury. Cranmer was one of Anne's protégés, a religious reformer who owed his position to her influence with the king. His ruling was a foregone conclusion. He was hardly going to rule against the woman who had made his career, but it gave the legal cover Henry needed to proceed. Anne's coronation followed in June, an elaborate spectacle designed to demonstrate to the world that she was now queen and that anyone who suggested otherwise was guilty of treason. She processed through London in a golden litter, surrounded by pageantry and splendour, her dark hair flowing loose in the traditional style of a virgin bride. Though given her advanced pregnancy, that particular symbolism must have struck some observers as optimistic. The citizens of London turned out to watch, though reports suggest the crowds were notably less enthusiastic than had been hoped. Some people cheered, but many remained silent, and a few brave souls reportedly held up their fingers in a gesture representing "ha ha," Henry and Anne's intertwined initials, but also a mocking laugh at the whole spectacle. Anne was crowned in Westminster Abbey, the crown of queens placed on her head, the ritual words spoken that made her Henry VIII's consort and the mother of England's future monarchs. She had achieved everything she had worked for, everything she had waited for, everything she had risked her life and reputation to obtain. She was queen, and she was also, though she could not have known it, just 3 years away from the scaffold. But let us dwell for a moment on this triumph, this achievement that was so extraordinary by any measure. A knight's granddaughter had become queen of one of Europe's great kingdoms. A woman of no particular birth had displaced a Spanish princess backed by the Holy Roman Emperor. Through a combination of wit, beauty, determination, and sheer force of will, Anne Boleyn had risen higher than anyone could have predicted. She had also helped spark a religious revolution that would shape English history for centuries to come. The Church of England that emerged from these years would evolve and change, swinging back toward Catholicism under Mary the War and then back toward Protestantism under Elizabeth II, but it would never return to full communion with Rome. The break Henry made for love, or at least for what he called love, became permanent. Anne's role in all this remains debated. Was she the architect of the Reformation, pushing Henry toward a break he might not otherwise have made? Or was she simply a convenient excuse for changes that would have happened anyway, given the underlying tensions between royal authority and papal claims? The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. Anne didn't create the conditions that made the Reformation possible, but she gave Henry a powerful personal incentive to take the revolutionary steps that brought it about. Without Anne, the break with Rome might have happened differently or later or not at all. What we can say with certainty is that Anne Boleyn was not a passive participant in these events. She was an active agent, promoting religious reform, cultivating reformist clergy, putting books in the king's hands that shaped his thinking about his own authority. She used her influence deliberately and strategically, advancing an agenda that went beyond simply becoming queen. Whether that agenda was driven by genuine religious conviction, or political calculation, or some combination of both, it had consequences that extended far beyond her own short life. The religious changes of these years also created the framework for Anne's eventual destruction. The same royal supremacy that allowed Henry to marry her without papal approval also allowed him to dispose of her when she proved disappointing. The same concentration of power in the crown that freed Henry from Rome's constraints also freed him from any constraints at all. Anne had helped create a system in which the king's will was law, and she would discover, to her cost, just how dangerous that system could be when the king's will turned against her. But that discovery was still in the future. In the summer of 1533, Anne was riding high, crowned, pregnant, seemingly secure in the king's affection. The religious revolution she had helped inspire was transforming England. The enemies she had made were scattered and demoralized. Everything seemed possible. The time had come, just as she had written in her prayer book so many years ago at Havre. Anne had risen to heights she could barely have imagined as a child in Kent. She had changed the course of English history. She had won. The only question now was whether she could keep what she had won, whether the king's love would last, whether the child she was carrying would be the son everyone expected, whether the enemies she had made would remain scattered, or whether they would find a way to bring her down. Those questions would be answered soon enough. The story was not over, far from it. But for this chapter, let us leave Anne at her moment of triumph, crowned Queen of England, carrying what she hoped was a prince, having achieved everything she set out to achieve. The time had come, and for one brief, glorious moment, Anne Boleyn was on top of the world. What happened next would prove that even the greatest triumphs can contain the seeds of the greatest falls. But that is a story for another chapter, when we'll follow Anne from coronation to catastrophe, from the birth of a princess to the death of a queen. The pieces are all in place now. The religious revolution has been accomplished. The marriage has been made. The crown has been placed on Anne's head. Everything that follows will grow from the foundations we have laid, the ambition, the love, the theological arguments, the political manoeuvring, all of it coming together in these crucial months of 1533. Let the story settle in your mind. Let the characters we have met take their places on the stage. The drama is approaching its climax, and when we return we will watch it unfold in all its terrible glory. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England. The woman who changed history. The woman who was about to discover that changing history was the easy part. Surviving the consequences was something else entirely. The story continues as it must. There is so much more to tell, and so we pause here, at the height of Anne's triumph, knowing what she could not know, that the height is also the beginning of the fall. But let us not anticipate. Let us hold this moment, this achievement, this extraordinary ascent from country house to royal palace. The time came for Anne Boleyn. She seized it with both hands. What happened next would test everything she had and everything she was. That tale awaits us in the chapters ahead. But before we move on, let us explore some aspects of this period that deserve more attention. The years between Anne's return to England and her coronation were not simply a waiting game. They were years of intense political manoeuvring, personal transformation, and social upheaval that reshaped the English court and eventually English society itself. Consider the daily reality of Anne's position during the long years of waiting. She was neither wife nor mistress, neither queen nor commoner, but something in between, a woman in limbo, her entire future dependent on the outcome of negotiations happening in Rome, in universities across Europe, in the labyrinthine corridors of papal politics. Every day she woke up not knowing whether this would be the day news arrived that would make her a queen or leave her ruined. The psychological strain must have been immense, and she was not waiting in comfortable obscurity. Anne was constantly on display, constantly scrutinised, constantly gossiped about by a court that had nothing better to do than speculate about the king's love life. Every dress she wore was analysed for its meaning. Every conversation she had was reported and interpreted. Every gesture, every glance, every smile was subject to the endless commentary of people who had very strong opinions about whether she should become queen, and were not shy about expressing them. Catherine's supporters, in particular, made Anne's life as difficult as they could within the constraints of court protocol. They whispered about her behind her back and sometimes to her face. They made pointed remarks about legitimate queens and illegitimate pretenders. They refused to show her the deference she increasingly expected and demanded. The court was divided into factions, and the tension between them was palpable. Anne developed a reputation for a sharp tongue during these years, a willingness to give as good as she got, to strike back at those who slighted her, to defend her position with whatever weapons were available to her. This served, but it also earned her enemies, people who remembered insults real or imagined and who would be only too happy to see her fall when the time came. Her relationship with Catherine was particularly complicated. On one level, they were rivals for the same man, engaged in a zero-sum competition that could only end with one of them triumphant and the other destroyed. On another level, they were both women trapped in a system they had not created, both subject to the whims of a king who held absolute power over their fates. Catherine had been good to Anne when Anne was just another lady in waiting. She had treated her kindly, included her in court activities, shown her the courtesy due to a young woman of good family, and Anne had repaid that kindness by stealing her husband. Whether Anne felt any guilt about this is impossible to say. She may have rationalised her actions by believing, as Henry did, that the marriage to Catherine had never been valid in the first place, in which case she wasn't stealing anyone's husband, merely claiming a man who had never truly belonged to someone else. She may have felt that in the brutal game of Tudor politics sentiment was a luxury she could not afford, or she may have simply not cared, her ambition overwhelming any softer feelings she might have had. What we do know is that Anne was determined to see Catherine removed, not just from Henry's bed, but from England itself. She pushed for Catherine to be sent abroad, where she could no longer serve as a rallying point for opposition to Anne's position. She resented any signs of affection Henry showed toward Catherine, any lingering attachment that might threaten her own security. She wanted Catherine gone, completely, permanently, irreversibly gone. Catherine, for her part, refused to go. She insisted on her rights, demanded to be treated as queen, and generally made herself as inconvenient as possible. Even when she was moved to increasingly remote and uncomfortable residences, she continued to sign her letters as Catherine the Queen, and to insist that her marriage was valid. The love letters Henry wrote to Anne during these years reveal a man in the grip of an obsession that bordered on mania. He wrote to her constantly, sometimes multiple times a day, pouring out his feelings in terms that range from ardent to pathetic. He complained of her absences, begged for her replies, analysed her every word for signs of encouragement or discouragement. He was, by any reasonable standard, a middle-aged man making a fool of himself over a woman half his age. But he was also the King of England, which meant that everyone had to pretend this was perfectly normal royal behaviour. The letters also reveal something of Anne's strategy. Henry frequently complained that she was cool to him, that her letters were shorter and less affectionate than his, that she kept him at arm's length, even as she accepted his gifts and his devotion. This was classic courtly love technique. The woman must always seem slightly out of reach, slightly unattainable to keep the man's interest at its peak. Anne was playing Henry like a fish on a line, giving him just enough to keep him hooked while never quite letting him land her. But there may have been more to Anne's reserve than simple gamesmanship. Some historians have suggested that Anne was never really in love with Henry, that she saw him as a means to an end rather than as a man she genuinely desired. By the time Henry began pursuing her seriously, he was in his mid-30s, beginning to lose the athletic beauty of his youth, and increasingly prone to the leg ulcers and other health problems that would plague him for the rest of his life. He was not, in other words, the dashing prince of the early portraits. He was a middle-aged man with a wife problem and an uncertain temper. What Anne genuinely felt for Henry remains one of the great mysteries of this story. She certainly performed affection convincingly enough to keep him interested for 7 years. But whether there was real feeling behind the performance, or whether it was all calculation from the beginning, we will never know for certain. The religious dimension of their relationship deepened during these years of waiting. Anne continued to promote evangelical ideas, sharing books and pamphlets with Henry, introducing him to reformist clergy, and generally encouraging his drift away from Catholic orthodoxy. Some historians have seen this as entirely cynical, Anne pushing religious reform because it served her political interests, not because she actually believed in it. Others have argued that her faith was genuine, that she sincerely believed the church needed to be reformed and saw her influence with Henry as a way to achieve that goal. The truth is probably more complicated than either simple explanation allows. Anne's religious interests seem to have developed during her years in France, where evangelical ideas were circulating among educated people. She continued to explore these ideas after her return to England, reading widely, discussing theology with learned men, and developing views that would have been considered dangerously heterodox by conservative churchmen. At the same time, her religious convictions happened to align perfectly with her political interests. The same ideas that justified breaking with Rome also justified breaking Henry's marriage to Catherine. Whether this was happy coincidence or careful calculation, or some mixture of both, we cannot say. What we can say is that Anne used her influence to advance the cause of religious reform in ways that had lasting consequences. She promoted clergy who shared her views, including Thomas Cranmer, who would become Archbishop of Canterbury and preside over the English Reformation for decades after Anne's death. She encouraged the production and distribution of English Bibles, believing that ordinary people should be able to read Scripture for themselves rather than depending on priests to interpret it for them. She advocated for the dissolution of monasteries and the redistribution of their wealth, though she would not live to see the full implementation of this policy. These were not the actions of a woman who cared only about becoming queen. Anne was genuinely committed to religious change, whatever her motives for that commitment might have been. And the changes she helped bring about outlasted her by centuries, shaping English religion and culture in ways that are still visible today. Cardinal Wolsey's fall from power in 1529 was both a consequence of the great matter and a clearing of the path toward Anne's ultimate triumph. Wolsey had been the most powerful man in England for nearly 2 decades, serving as Henry's chief minister and papal legate, accumulating wealth and influence that rivaled the king's own. But he had failed to deliver the annulment Henry so desperately wanted, and failure in the Tudor world was rarely forgiven. Anne certainly contributed to Wolsey's destruction. She had never forgiven him for breaking up her engagement to Henry Percy years earlier, and she used her influence with Henry to poison the king against his longtime servant. But Wolsey's fall was also the logical consequence of his own position. He had promised Henry the annulment and failed to deliver. He had made himself indispensable, which meant that his failures were impossible to overlook or excuse. When the king's patience finally ran out, Wolsey found himself stripped of his offices, his properties, and his dignity, forced to retreat to his Archbishopric of York like a wounded animal crawling away to die, which is precisely what he did. Wolsey died in November 1530 while travelling south to face charges of treason, reportedly saying on his deathbed, "If I had served God as diligently as I have served the king, he would not have given me over in my grey hairs." It was a fitting epitaph for a man who had devoted his entire career to serving royal interests, only to be discarded the moment he ceased to be useful. With Wolsey gone, the path was clear for new advisers who were willing to take more radical approaches to the great matter. Thomas Cromwell emerged as the key figure in this new dispensation, a brilliant, ruthless administrator who would orchestrate the break with Rome and the dismantling of the medieval church in England. Cromwell was not a religious reformer in the same sense as Anne. His interests were primarily political and economic, but he recognised that religious reform served the crown's interests, and he was willing to use whatever tools were available to achieve his goals. The alliance between Anne, Cromwell, and the various reformist clergy they promoted would drive the revolutionary changes of the early 1530s. It was an unlikely coalition: a knight's granddaughter, a blacksmith's son who had risen through intelligence and cunning, and a collection of theologians whose ideas would have gotten them burned at the stake a few years earlier. But they shared a common goal: breaking the power of Rome in England and establishing royal supremacy over the Church. The opposition to these changes was significant but ultimately ineffective. Catherine had powerful supporters, including the Emperor Charles V, but they were unable to intervene directly in English affairs. The Pope threatened various sanctions, including excommunication, but Henry called his bluff, and the Pope, entangled in his own political problems, was unable to follow through effectively. The English clergy, divided and intimidated, mostly went along with the changes rather than risking the king's displeasure. Thomas More's resistance was the most principled and the most costly. More had been Lord Chancellor, the highest legal officer in the land, and he resigned his position rather than support the break with Rome. He withdrew from public life, hoping that his silence would protect him while preserving his conscience. But silence was not enough for Henry, who demanded active support from all his subjects. When More refused to swear the oath acknowledging Henry as supreme head of the church, he was arrested, tried, and executed. More's death in July 1535 sent a clear message about the cost of resistance. If one of the most respected men in England could lose his head for refusing to acknowledge the new order, then no one was safe. The message was received. Opposition to Henry's religious revolution diminished sharply after More's execution, and those who still harboured doubts learned to keep them to themselves. Anne watched all of this from her position at the king's side: the arrests, the trials, the executions of those who refused to accept the new reality. She was complicit in these deaths, at least to some extent. She had encouraged Henry down the path that led here. She had promoted the men who drafted the legislation and prosecuted the resistors. She had benefited directly and personally from every step of the process. Whether she felt any qualms about the human cost of her elevation, we cannot know. The historical record preserves no expressions of doubt or regret from Anne during these years. She may have believed, as Henry did, that the resistors had brought their fate upon themselves by defying legitimate royal authority. She may have been too focused on her own precarious position to spare much sympathy for others, or she may have felt regret that she simply never expressed, knowing that any sign of weakness would be exploited by her enemies. What we do know is that Anne's coronation in June 1533 came at the end of a period of tremendous upheaval, during which the religious and political landscape of England had been fundamentally transformed. The woman who was crowned that day was not simply a new queen. She was the symbol of a revolution, the embodiment of everything that had changed and everything that could never be unchanged. The crowds who watched her procession through London knew this, even if they didn't fully understand its implications. Some cheered, welcoming the new order or simply enjoying the spectacle. Others remained silent, mourning the old certainties that had been swept away. A few made their displeasure known more openly, risking royal displeasure to express their opposition to everything Anne represented. Anne, for her part, held her head high and played her role with the dignity and grace that her French education had taught her. She was queen now, whatever anyone thought about how she had achieved that position. The crown was on her head. The child was in her belly. The future, she must have believed, was hers. She was wrong about that, as we know. but she didn't know it yet. And for one brief moment, as the crown settled onto her dark hair and the congregation in Westminster Abbey acknowledged her as Queen, Anne Boleyn had everything she had ever wanted. The time had come. Now she just had to keep it. The wedding that changed England took place not in some grand cathedral with thousands of witnesses, but in a small chamber in Whitehall Palace in the grey early hours of a January morning in 1533. There were perhaps a handful of people present. The precise number and identity of the witnesses remain disputed to this day. The ceremony was conducted quickly, quietly, and with a degree of secrecy that seems almost furtive for a royal marriage. Henry VIII, King of England, was marrying Anne Boleyn at last, after 7 years of waiting, scheming, and religious revolution. And he was doing it in circumstances that felt less like a triumphant culmination than a hurried affair conducted before anyone could stop them. The secrecy was, of course, entirely necessary. Henry was still technically married to Catherine of Aragon. The formal annulment would not be pronounced until May. The Pope had not given his blessing and never would. The break with Rome was still in progress, the legal framework for the king's supremacy over the church still being constructed. If word got out that Henry had married Anne before any of these matters were resolved, the scandal would be enormous. Foreign powers might intervene. Domestic opposition might crystallize. The whole delicate enterprise might collapse. So the king and his new queen exchanged their vows in near darkness, with only a trusted few to witness the moment. One imagines Anne, dressed not in the magnificent gown she deserved, but in something more modest, appropriate for a ceremony that had to happen before dawn. One imagines Henry, perhaps nervous despite his bluster, knowing that he was committing an act that would be considered bigamy by half of Christendom. One imagines the priest, whoever he was, as the records are unclear, speaking the ancient words with a slightly trembling voice, aware of the magnitude of what he was blessing. And then it was done. After 7 years, Anne Boleyn was finally married to the King of England. The goal she had pursued so relentlessly, the prize for which she had sacrificed so much, was hers. She was Henry's wife. In a few months she would be officially crowned as his queen. The impossible had become reality. But why the rush? Why the secrecy? Why marry in January when the formal annulment was still months away? The answer was growing inside Anne's body. She was pregnant. This was the best possible news and the most urgent possible complication. A pregnancy meant that Anne could finally deliver what Henry had wanted all along: an heir, a son, a continuation of the Tudor dynasty. But a pregnancy also meant a timetable that could not be negotiated with. The child had to be born legitimate, which meant the marriage had to be not just performed but publicly acknowledged, and Anne had to be crowned queen all before the baby arrived. There was no time to wait for Rome, no time to worry about international opinion, no time for anything except getting the necessary legal and ceremonial business completed before Anne's condition became too obvious to ignore. The timing was tight but manageable. January wedding, May annulment, June coronation, September birth. That was the schedule, and everyone worked frantically to keep to it. Thomas Cranmer, newly installed as Archbishop of Canterbury and thoroughly committed to the king's cause, pronounced the annulment with appropriate solemnity. The coronation was staged with all the magnificence that money and organisation could provide. And through it all, Anne carried the future of England, or so everyone assumed, in her increasingly visible belly. The pregnancy progressed normally, as far as we can tell from the historical record. Anne experienced the usual discomforts of her condition, modified her activities as appropriate, and awaited the arrival of the child with what must have been a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Everything depended on this baby. Her position, her security, her very life might depend on whether she could deliver the son that Henry had moved heaven and earth to obtain. The royal astrologers and physicians were unanimous. The child would be a boy. They could tell from various signs and portents that we would today consider complete nonsense. The way Anne carried, the timing of conception, the alignment of various celestial bodies. But in the 16th century such predictions were taken seriously, and everyone at court was preparing for the arrival of a prince. The name had already been chosen, Edward or Henry, depending on which account you believe. Announcements had been drafted proclaiming the birth of a prince. Jousts and celebrations were being planned to mark the arrival of the heir England had waited so long to see. On September 7, 1533, Anne went into labour at Greenwich Palace. The delivery was apparently straightforward, without the complications that often made childbirth so dangerous in this era. The baby emerged healthy and crying, everything a parent could hope for. There was just one problem. The baby was a girl. The disappointment was crushing, and it was felt not just by Henry but by everyone who had staked their fortunes on the new queen and her ability to produce an heir. After everything, the break with Rome, the disgrace of Catherine, the execution of Thomas More, the transformation of English religion, after all of that, Anne had produced a daughter. Another daughter. Just like Catherine before her. Henry's reaction has been the subject of much historical speculation. Some accounts suggest he was furious, barely able to conceal his rage behind a mask of public civility. Others suggest he was more philosophical, acknowledging that Anne was young and healthy and would surely produce sons in due course. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Henry was disappointed. Of course he was disappointed, he had waited 7 years for this moment. But he was also practical enough to recognise that one daughter did not mean the end of everything. There would be more pregnancies, more chances, more opportunities to get the heir he needed. The announcements that had been prepared had to be hastily modified. Where they had read prince, scribes now added an extra letter to make princess. The jousts and celebrations were scaled back or cancelled. The mood at court was subdued rather than jubilant. This was not the triumphant moment everyone had anticipated. The baby was named Elizabeth after Henry's mother, Elizabeth of York. It was a respectable name, a family name, a name that carried no particular expectations or disappointments. The little princess was given her own household, her own servants, her own establishment befitting her rank as heir to the throne, for she was the heir, now that Mary had been declared illegitimate along with her mother. Elizabeth Tudor, the daughter Anne had produced instead of a son, was the future of England. Of course, no one at the time could have known just how accurate that statement would prove to be. No one could have predicted that this disappointing baby girl would grow up to become one of the greatest monarchs in English history, that her reign would last 45 years and be remembered as a golden age, that she would defeat the Spanish Armada and preside over the flourishing of English literature and exploration and power. All they knew in September 1533 was that Anne had failed to produce a son, and that this failure, while not fatal, was a problem that needed to be corrected. Anne, for her part, seems to have been devoted to her daughter from the start. She breastfed Elizabeth herself initially, an unusual choice for a queen who would normally hand such duties over to a wet nurse, and took an active interest in the child's upbringing and education. Whatever disappointment she felt about not producing a son, she channeled it into ensuring that her daughter was raised with every advantage that rank and wealth could provide. But the pressure to produce a male heir did not diminish. If anything, it intensified. Anne had bet everything on being able to give Henry what Catherine could not, and so far she had delivered exactly what Catherine had delivered, a healthy daughter, but no son. The parallels must have been uncomfortable for everyone involved. Was Anne going to be another Catherine, producing one surviving daughter and then failing year after year to provide the male heir the kingdom needed? The answer to that question would take time to reveal itself, but the outlines of trouble were already becoming visible. Anne's position at court was more precarious than it appeared. She had enemies, lots of enemies, who had never accepted her rise to power and who were watching for any sign of weakness that might allow them to bring her down. The birth of a daughter instead of a son gave them hope. If Anne continued to disappoint, if she proved no more capable than Catherine of producing a male heir, then perhaps Henry might be persuaded to set her aside too. For the moment, though, Anne remained secure in Henry's affection, or at least secure enough. Henry visited her bedchamber, performed his marital duties, and waited for news of another pregnancy. Anne, still recovering from childbirth, knew that her future depended on conceiving again as quickly as possible, and on making sure that the next child was the son everyone expected. The months passed. Anne became pregnant again. Hope revived at court. Perhaps this time, finally, the long-awaited prince would arrive. But it was not to be. Anne miscarried, probably in the summer of 1534. The details are sparse. Royal miscarriages were not the kind of thing that got recorded in detail, but we know that a pregnancy that had begun promisingly ended in disappointment. Another failure, another missed opportunity, another reminder that Anne had not yet fulfilled the promise that justified her elevation. And then she conceived again, and miscarried again, or perhaps gave birth to a stillborn child. The records are unclear. The pattern that had haunted Catherine was repeating itself with Anne. Pregnancies that ended badly, hopes raised and dashed, the son who never came. Through all of this, Anne maintained her position, but her influence was beginning to wane. Henry was less devoted than he had been during the long years of pursuit. The chase, it seemed, had been more exciting than the capture. Now that Anne was his wife, Now that the thrill of the forbidden had been replaced by the routine of marriage, Henry's eye began to wander. There were other women at court, younger women, women who hadn't yet disappointed him, women who represented the possibility of a fresh start. Jane Seymour was one of these women. Quiet, modest, apparently virtuous, she was everything Anne was not, or at least everything Anne was perceived not to be. Where Anne was sharp-tongued and volatile, Jane seemed gentle and submissive. Where Anne had been the scandal of Christendom, Jane was a model of propriety. Where Anne had disrupted and destroyed, Jane might restore and heal. Henry noticed her. Of course he noticed her. That was what court ladies were for, to be noticed by the king. And Jane, or perhaps the faction behind her, noticed that she was being noticed. The game that Anne had played so brilliantly a decade earlier was being played again, this time with Anne in the role of the aging queen and Jane in the role of the fresh young challenger. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The final act of Anne's story had not yet begun. There was still one more chance, one more pregnancy, one more opportunity for Anne to save herself by delivering the son Henry needed. And that pregnancy, and its terrible ending, would prove to be the pivot on which everything turned. The year 1536 opened with apparent good news. Anne was pregnant again, and this time the signs seemed favourable. She had carried the child past the dangerous early months when miscarriages were most common. The physicians and astrologers were cautiously optimistic. Perhaps this would be the one. Perhaps this pregnancy would finally produce the son who would secure Anne's position forever. Catherine of Aragon died on January 7, 1536, at Kimbolton Castle, where she had been essentially imprisoned for the last years of her life. She had never accepted the annulment, never acknowledged Anne as queen, never stopped insisting that she was Henry's true wife. Now, at last, she was gone, and with her, the most powerful symbol of opposition to Henry's second marriage. Anne's reaction to the news has been reported in various ways by various sources. Some say she was openly gleeful, celebrating her rival's death with inappropriate enthusiasm. Others say she wept, perhaps from relief, perhaps from some more complicated emotion that even she might not have been able to explain. The truth is probably that Anne felt a mixture of things: relief that Catherine could no longer serve as a rallying point for opposition, perhaps some guilt about the suffering Catherine had endured, and certainly anxiety about what Catherine's death might mean for her own position. Because here was the uncomfortable reality. With Catherine dead, Henry was no longer technically a bigamist. If he wanted, the woman whose death should have strengthened Anne's position had, in a strange way, actually weakened it. Catherine had been an obstacle, but she had also been a kind of protection. As long as Catherine lived, Henry couldn't easily discard Anne without admitting that his first marriage had been valid all along. Now that Catherine was gone, that consideration no longer applied. Henry, for his part, seems to have received the news of Catherine's death with relief bordering on celebration. He dressed in yellow, a colour associated with mourning in Spain but with celebration in England, and reportedly paraded around the court with Anne, showing off their joy at being finally and truly free. He carried the little Princess Elizabeth in his arms, displaying her to the courtiers as if to say, "Look at my legitimate heir, born of my legitimate wife, with no shadow of the first marriage hanging over her any more." It was a display of poor taste, perhaps, but it was also a display of confidence. Henry and Anne were acting as if their troubles were over, as if Catherine's death had removed the last obstacle to their happiness. The pregnancy was progressing well. The religious settlement was holding. Everything seemed to be falling into place. And then, on January 24th, 1536, everything changed. The occasion was a jousting tournament at Greenwich, the kind of martial spectacle that Henry had loved since his youth. Even now, in his mid-40s, with his health beginning to deteriorate, Henry insisted on participating in these events. It was a way of proving that he was still the vigorous young king of the early portraits, still capable of feats of athleticism and martial prowess. Never mind that he was considerably heavier than he had been in his youth, that his leg ulcers caused him constant pain, that his reflexes were not what they once were. The king would joust and everyone would pretend to be impressed. On this particular day, something went wrong. The exact details vary depending on which account you read, but the essential facts are clear. Henry was thrown from his horse and lay unconscious for 2 hours, his armoured body crumpled on the ground while his attendants panicked around him. For 2 hours, the King of England showed no signs of life. For 2 hours, the succession, already complicated, hung in the balance. For 2 hours, England held its breath. He survived, obviously. Henry VIII would live another 11 years, marry 4 more wives, execute countless subjects, and transform England in ways that are still visible today. But some historians believe that the man who regained consciousness after that fall was not quite the same person who had lost consciousness. Something had changed. Something fundamental had shifted. The theory goes like this. The fall caused a traumatic brain injury that altered Henry's personality in significant ways. The charming, generous, affectionate king of the early reign became increasingly paranoid, suspicious, and cruel. The man who had once been content to delegate to trusted ministers became obsessed with controlling every aspect of his realm. The husband who had waited 7 years for Anne Boleyn became capable of sending her to the scaffold barely 3 years after their wedding. Is this theory true? We can't know for certain. We can't examine Henry's brain, can't perform the medical tests that would reveal the extent of any injury, can't compare before and after scans to see what changed. But the circumstantial evidence is suggestive. Henry's behaviour did change after the fall, became more erratic, more violent, more unpredictable. The timing is right. The pattern fits. And there's another piece of evidence that suggests the fall had profound consequences. 5 days after Henry's accident, Anne miscarried. The child she lost was a boy. Imagine the horror of that moment. Anne, already anxious about her husband's near-death experience, already stressed by the political uncertainties swirling around her, goes into premature labour and delivers a dead fetus, a male fetus, the son she had been trying to produce for years, the heir who would have secured her position forever. All that waiting, all that hoping, all that praying, and the son finally arrives too early, too small, too dead to save her. The timing is almost certainly not coincidental. Stress and trauma can trigger miscarriages, and Anne had experienced both in abundance during those January days. The news of her husband lying unconscious on the tournament ground, the uncertainty about whether he would live or die, the sudden terrifying vision of a future in which she was a widow without a son, all of this would have taken a physical toll on her pregnant body. Some accounts suggest that Anne blamed the miscarriage on the shock of Henry's fall, and that this defence only made Henry angrier. He didn't want excuses, he wanted a son, and Anne, like Catherine before her, had failed to give him one. Some contemporary accounts described it as deformed, which enemies later used to suggest that Anne was a witch who had produced a demon child. This is almost certainly propaganda rather than fact. Stillborn and miscarried fetuses often appear abnormal to untrained observers, and Anne's enemies had every reason to make her reproductive failures seem as sinister as possible. What we know for certain is that the miscarriage marked a turning point in Henry's attitude toward Anne. Whatever affection remained between them seems to have evaporated in the aftermath of this loss. Henry reportedly told Anne that he would have no more boys by her, a devastating statement that essentially declared their marriage over in everything but name. Whether this was a prediction or a threat, it signalled that Henry had given up on Anne as a mother of his heirs. The machinery of destruction began to turn. Within weeks of the miscarriage, Thomas Cromwell, once Anne's ally, now sensing which way the wind was blowing, began building a case against her. Jane Seymour was being positioned as Anne's replacement, coached to play the role of virtuous maiden that Anne had once played so effectively. The court was dividing into factions, with those who had risen with Anne now scrambling to distance themselves before she fell. Anne must have sensed what was coming, but there was little she could do to stop it. Her weapons had always been her wit, her charm, her ability to captivate Henry's attention. But those weapons were useless against a husband who had already decided to be rid of her. The man who had once hung on her every word now avoided her company. The king who had written desperate love letters now communicated through intermediaries. The tide had turned, and Anne was being swept toward destruction. The physical changes in Henry after the jousting accident may have accelerated this process. If the fall did indeed cause some kind of brain injury, it might help explain the speed and ruthlessness with which he moved against Anne in the months that followed. The Henry who had waited 7 years to marry her, who had overturned the religious order of England for her sake, might have been capable of a more gradual disengagement. The Henry who emerged from that 2-hour unconsciousness seems to have been capable of anything. But we should be careful not to make Henry entirely a victim of circumstances beyond his control. Brain injury or no brain injury, Henry was responsible for his own choices. He chose to abandon Anne. He chose to pursue Jane Seymour. He chose to believe, or pretend to believe, the accusations that would soon be levelled against his wife. Whatever changes the fall may have caused, they don't excuse what followed. The early months of 1536 were a strange twilight period for Anne, still queen, still technically secure, but increasingly isolated and vulnerable. She quarrelled with Cromwell over the disposition of monastery lands, making an enemy of the one man who might have protected her. She quarrelled with Henry over his attention to Jane Seymour, displaying the jealous temper that had once seemed charming but now seemed merely tiresome. She quarrelled with everyone, it seemed, as if sensing that the walls were closing in and lashing out in all directions. Her enemies were gathering, sharing information, building their case. The accusations that would ultimately destroy her were being assembled piece by piece. The men who would be named as her alleged lovers were being identified and watched. The trap was being set, and Anne walked into it with her eyes wide open but her options exhausted. Henry had moved on. That was the essential fact that everything else flowed from. He had moved on from Anne just as he had moved on from Catherine, just as he would later move on from Jane and Anne of Cleves and Catherine Howard. His love, such as it was, had always been conditional. Conditional on getting what he wanted, conditional on being pleased, conditional on his partner meeting his ever-shifting expectations. Anne had met those expectations for a while, and then she hadn't, and now she was about to discover what happened to queens who disappointed their king. The fall from the horse was not the cause of Anne's downfall, but it was a catalyst that accelerated everything that followed. It may have changed Henry in ways that made him more capable of cruelty, more willing to destroy the woman he had once loved. It certainly triggered the miscarriage that destroyed Anne's last hope of saving herself through motherhood, and it marked the moment when the fairy tale definitively ended and the tragedy began. From January 1536 onward, Anne Boleyn was living on borrowed time. She just didn't know how little time she had left. The court watched and waited, sensing blood in the water. Jane Seymour practiced her modest smiles and her submissive demeanour, preparing for the role she would soon be called upon to play. Cromwell gathered evidence and testimony, real and fabricated, that would provide legal cover for what was essentially a royal murder. And Henry, recovered from his fall but changed in ways that no one fully understood, contemplated the wife he no longer wanted and began to imagine a future without her. The cracks in the foundation had become chasms. The building that Anne had constructed so carefully over so many years was about to collapse entirely, and when it fell it would bury not just Anne but everyone who had risen with her. That collapse, the arrests, the trials, the executions, awaits us in the next chapter. But for now, let us hold this moment, a queen who has lost her last hope, a king who has lost whatever capacity for mercy he once possessed, and a kingdom waiting to see what would happen next. The time that Anne had written about so long ago had come and was now passing. The moment of triumph had given way to the moment of disaster. Everything she had gained was about to be taken away. And there was nothing at all she could do to stop it. The story continues, as it must, toward its inevitable and terrible conclusion. The scaffold on Tower Green awaits, just a few months away now, though Anne cannot yet see it from where she stands. The French swordsman has not yet been summoned from Calais. The charges have not yet been filed. The trial has not yet taken place. But all of that is coming. The machinery is in motion. The end is approaching. Let the story settle into your mind as we prepare for the final act. We have seen her rise higher than anyone could have predicted, and begin the fall that will end in her destruction. What remains is the fall itself, swift, brutal, and absolute. What remains is the trial, the conviction, the execution of a queen. What remains is the aftermath, the legacy, the long shadow that Anne Boleyn casts across English history even today. That story awaits us. The time is coming when we must follow Anne into the tower and watch her final days unfold. The drama approaches its climax. The tragedy nears its end. But before we leave this chapter, let us dwell a little longer on the details that help us understand how completely Anne's world collapsed in those early months of 1536. The transformation was so swift, so total, that it almost defies comprehension. One moment she was queen, pregnant with what might be the future King of England. The next moment she was a woman marked for destruction, her husband openly courting her replacement, her allies abandoning her one by one. Consider the emotional whiplash Anne must have experienced in those few weeks of January 1536. On January 7th she learned that Catherine of Aragon was dead, news that should have been cause for celebration, the final removal of the woman who had stood between Anne and unchallenged queenship for so many years. On January 24th she nearly lost her husband to a jousting accident, spending 2 agonizing hours not knowing whether she would be a widow by nightfall. On January 29th, she miscarried a son, the male heir she had promised Henry, the child who would have justified everything, delivered dead and lifeless 4.5 months before his time. 3 weeks. That's all it took for Anne's world to go from apparent security to total collapse. 3 weeks in which death visited the court twice, taking Catherine permanently and Henry temporarily, and in which Anne's body betrayed her at the worst possible moment. The secret wedding we discussed earlier now takes on a different significance when viewed through the lens of these later events. That hurried ceremony in January 1533 had been necessary because Anne was pregnant and the child needed to be born legitimate. But it had also been a gamble, a bet that Anne could deliver what she promised, that she could give Henry the son he needed, that she could justify all the upheaval her elevation had caused. For 3 years, that bet had seemed promising, if not yet won. Elizabeth's birth had been a disappointment, certainly, but Anne was young and healthy, and there was every reason to expect more children. The miscarriages and failed pregnancies that followed had been concerning, but not yet catastrophic. These things happened to even the most fertile women, and Anne had not yet reached the age where her childbearing years could be considered over. But the miscarriage of January 1536 was different. It was different because the child was a boy, the very thing Henry had been seeking for 20 years. It was different because it came so close to success. Anne had carried the pregnancy for 3.5 months past the most dangerous period before something went wrong. And it was different because of the timing, coming just days after Catherine's death and Henry's accident, suggesting that Anne's body was somehow responsive to external stress in ways that made her unreliable as a vessel for royal heirs. Henry's reaction to the miscarriage has been reported in various ways, but all the accounts agree on one essential point. He was devastated, and he blamed Anne. "I see that God will not give me male children," he reportedly said, in a statement that sounded less like grief than like a judicial verdict. The implication was clear. Just as God had cursed Henry's first marriage because of the Leviticus prohibition, God was now cursing his second marriage for some other reason. And if the marriage was cursed, then perhaps it needed to end. The cruel irony is that we now know, or at least strongly suspect, that the problem was never with Henry's wives at all. Modern medical analysis has suggested that Henry himself may have had a condition that made it difficult for him to father healthy children, possibly Kell syndrome or some other genetic abnormality that would have caused many of his wives' pregnancies to fail regardless of who those wives were. Catherine, but 16th century medicine had no way of knowing this. In Henry's world, reproductive failure was always the woman's fault, a judgment of God on her unworthiness, a sign of some hidden sin or defect. When Catherine failed to produce a son, Henry convinced himself that the failure was divine punishment for marrying his brother's widow. When Anne failed to produce a son, Henry began to convince himself that this failure too must have some sinister explanation. The explanation he eventually settled on, with considerable help from Thomas Cromwell and Anne's other enemies, was that Anne had committed adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, that she had conspired to murder the king, that she had used witchcraft to ensnare Henry in the first place. These charges were almost certainly false, but they served Henry's purpose perfectly. They transformed Anne from a disappointing wife into a criminal who deserved to die, freeing Henry from the uncomfortable acknowledgement that he had destroyed his first marriage for a woman who proved no more capable than Catherine of giving him what he wanted. But that final act of the drama was still a few months away in January 1536. For the moment, Anne was still queen, still nominally in Henry's favour, still hoping that perhaps things could be salvaged. She couldn't know that Henry had already given up on her, that the wheels of her destruction were already beginning to turn. Let us consider more carefully the jousting accident that may have changed everything. Tudor jousting was not the sanitized spectacle we might imagine from Renaissance fairs. It was genuinely dangerous, with armoured men charging at each other on horseback, wielding lances that could inflict serious injury even through protective gear. Deaths and serious injuries were common. The accident at Greenwich happened during a practice session rather than a formal tournament. Henry was thrown from his horse, which itself fell and landed on him, and lay unconscious on the ground for approximately 2 hours. His attendants feared he was dead. Messengers were sent racing through the palace with the terrible news. The succession, already complicated by the religious revolution, and the displacement of Mary in favour of Elizabeth hung in the balance. During those 2 hours, everyone at court was forced to contemplate what would happen if Henry died. Elizabeth was not yet 3 years old, far too young to rule on her own. A regency would be needed, but who would serve as regent? Anne? The nobility? Some combination? And what about? The potential for chaos was enormous. England had not had a child monarch since the disasters of Henry VI's reign, and no one was eager to repeat that experience. If Henry died that day, the kingdom might have descended into civil war, with various factions fighting over who should control the government, and ultimately who should wear the crown. Anne must have been beside herself during those 2 hours. Her husband, her protector, her source of power, the only thing standing between her and her enemies, might be dying. If he died, her position would become almost impossibly precarious. She might retain some influence as the mother of the heir, but she would be surrounded by people who hated her, who had never accepted her as queen, who would be only too happy to see her destroyed. And she was pregnant. She was carrying what might be the next King of England, or what might be another disappointment like Elizabeth. The stress of those hours, the terror of uncertainty, the physical toll of fear and grief, all of this would have placed tremendous strain on her pregnant body. When Henry regained consciousness, the immediate crisis passed, but nothing was quite the same afterward. Some historians have noted changes in Henry's personality following the accident: increased irritability, decreased patience, a greater willingness to use violence against those who displeased him. Whether this was due to traumatic brain injury or simply to the psychological impact of a near-death experience, the Henry who emerged from that accident was more dangerous than the Henry who had fallen from his horse. 5 days later, Anne miscarried. The connection seems obvious in retrospect, but we should be careful about assuming too much. Correlation is not causation, and there may have been other factors: a genetic abnormality in the fetus, an infection, something wrong with the pregnancy that would have caused a miscarriage regardless of external events. But the timing is striking, and Anne herself reportedly blamed the miscarriage on the shock of learning about Henry's accident. This explanation did not satisfy Henry. Nothing Anne could say would satisfy him at this point. He had made his decision, perhaps not consciously yet, but emotionally, that Anne was a failure, just as Catherine had been a failure before her. The dream of a son, the promise that had justified everything, had once again turned to ashes, and Henry, rather than accepting any responsibility himself, chose to blame the woman who had failed to deliver what he demanded. The lost prince, for that is what the miscarried fetus was, a prince who never got to live, joins the long list of might-have-beens that haunt Tudor history. If he had survived, everything might have been different. Anne might have lived. The later wives might never have been necessary. The religious settlement might have been more secure. The whole trajectory of English history might have shifted in ways we can barely imagine. But he didn't survive. He died in the womb, a tiny body with enormous implications, and his death sealed his mother's fate as surely as if he had never been conceived at all. After the miscarriage, Anne's position deteriorated rapidly. Henry began spending more time with Jane Seymour, making his interest increasingly obvious. Anne confronted him about it, her famous temper getting the better of her diplomatic instincts, and the confrontations only pushed Henry further away. She was behaving exactly as Catherine had behaved during Henry's pursuit of Anne, and the results were exactly the same. The more she complained, the more determined Henry became to be rid of her. The parallel was not lost on observers at the time. Anne, who had displaced Catherine through persistence and patience, was now being displaced through the same methods. Jane Seymour, coached by her ambitious family, was playing the role Anne had played a decade earlier, the virtuous maiden who would not give herself to the king except in honourable marriage. History was repeating itself, with Anne cast in the role of the ageing queen rather than the fresh challenger. The irony must have been bitter. Anne knew exactly what was happening because she had done it herself. She knew the game Jane was playing because she'd invented it. But knowing didn't help. She couldn't compete with Jane's youth, her novelty, her unblemished record of reproductive potential. All Anne had to offer was her wit and her history with Henry, and neither was enough anymore. The court watched this transformation with the mixture of fascination and horror that accompanies any royal scandal. Those who had risen with Anne began calculating how to survive her fall. Those who had opposed her from the beginning sensed that their moment was approaching. Everyone was choosing sides, positioning themselves for whatever came next. Anne, increasingly isolated, increasingly desperate, made the mistake of alienating Thomas Cromwell in these crucial months. Cromwell had been her ally during the break with Rome, had helped orchestrate the legal revolution that made her queenship possible. But now they disagreed over what should happen to the wealth of the dissolved monasteries. Anne wanted it used for education and charity, while Cromwell wanted it distributed to the crown and the nobility. The disagreement was about policy, but it became personal, and Cromwell decided that his future lay in accommodating Henry's desire to be rid of Anne rather than in protecting her. This was perhaps the most fateful decision of Anne's final months. Cromwell had the skills and the ruthlessness to destroy her, and now he had the motivation as well. By early spring of 1536 the trap was being prepared. Cromwell was gathering evidence, or manufacturing evidence, depending on how you interpret the historical record of Anne's alleged crimes. Witnesses were being identified and pressured. A narrative was being constructed that would transform Anne from a disappointing wife into a monster of depravity who deserved to die. Anne may have sensed what was coming, but there was nothing she could do to prevent it. Her weapons had always been her charm and her influence over Henry, but Henry was now immune to her charm and her influence had evaporated. She was a queen without power, a wife without a husband's love, a mother without a living son to protect her position. The cracks in the foundation had become fatal fractures. The building was about to fall, and so we leave Anne at this moment of supreme vulnerability, knowing what she could not know, that she had only weeks left to live, that the accusations were being prepared, that the men who would be named as her alleged lovers were being watched and would soon be arrested. The final act of her story is about to begin. The arrests, the trials, the executions, all of it is coming, faster than anyone could have anticipated. The woman who had risen so high was about to fall so fast that it would take the breath away from everyone who witnessed it. That fall is the subject of our next chapter. But for now, let the weight of what we've discussed settle into your mind. The secret wedding that began with such hope. The birth of Elizabeth that brought such disappointment. The jousting accident that may have changed Henry's very personality. The miscarriage that ended Anne's last hope. The gathering storm of enemies that would soon break over her head. All the pieces are in place. The tragedy is about to reach its climax. The story continues. The Tudor court was, in many ways, the 16th century equivalent of a particularly vicious social media platform, except instead of anonymous accounts and disappearing messages, you had courtiers with sharp tongues and servants with excellent memories. Gossip travelled at roughly the speed of a brisk walk, which in a palace the size of Whitehall was still remarkably fast. Reputations could be built or destroyed between breakfast and dinner. And once a story started circulating, there was absolutely no way to make it stop. No delete button, no clarification, no fact-checkers to separate truth from fiction. Anne Boleyn, having risen to the throne on a wave of scandal and controversy, was always going to be vulnerable to the kind of whispered destruction that the court did so well. She had enemies everywhere, supporters of the displaced Catherine, religious conservatives who blamed her for the break with Rome, nobles who resented her family's rapid rise, women who envied her position. All of these people were watching, waiting, collecting every scrap of information that might be used against her when the moment was right. And in early 1536, with Henry's attention clearly shifting to Jane Seymour, that moment had arrived. Jane Seymour was, in almost every visible way, Anne Boleyn's opposite. Where Anne was dark, Jane was fair. Where Anne was witty and sharp-tongued, Jane was quiet and demure. Where Anne had been the centre of scandal for nearly a decade, Jane had no scandal attached to her name whatsoever. She was, as far as anyone could tell, exactly what she appeared to be, a modest, virtuous, unremarkable young woman whose greatest asset was not being Anne Boleyn. This was not an accident. Jane, Henry had tried the clever, sophisticated, independent-minded woman. That experiment had not ended well, at least from Henry's perspective. Now perhaps he was ready for something different. A woman who would be obedient, submissive, and uncomplicated. A woman who would give him sons without giving him headaches. Jane played her role to perfection. When Henry sent her gifts, she returned them unopened, declaring that she could not accept presents from a married man, and that her honour was her greatest treasure. Sound familiar? It should. This was exactly the strategy Anne had used against Henry a decade earlier. Jane was essentially using Anne's own playbook against her, with the crucial difference that Jane was presenting herself as virtuous and traditional rather than clever and revolutionary. The message was clear: Jane was not going to be a mistress. If Henry wanted her, he would have to marry her. And since he was already married to Anne, that meant Anne would have to go. The parallels between this situation and Anne's own rise are almost too neat, too perfectly ironic to be believed. But history sometimes does work that way, serving up symmetries and echoes that a novelist would be criticised for inventing. Anne had displaced Catherine through patience, virtue, or at least the appearance of virtue, and the strategic withholding of sexual favours. Now Jane was displacing Anne through exactly the same methods. The wheel had come full circle. For Anne, watching this unfold must have been agonising. She knew what Jane was doing because she had done it herself. She could see every move in the game, predict every feint and manoeuvre, because she had invented the game. But knowing didn't help. She was on the wrong side of the board now, playing defence instead of offence, trying to hold on to what she had rather than reaching for what she wanted. The court noticed, of course. They always noticed everything. The whispers began almost immediately. The king was tired of Anne. The king was in love with Jane Seymour. The king might set Anne aside just as he had set Catherine aside. The parallels were obvious to everyone, and everyone was adjusting their behaviour accordingly. This is where the comparison to more recent royal scandals becomes almost irresistible. Think about the media coverage of other famous royal marriages that went wrong, the endless speculation, the taking of sides, the dissection of every gesture and expression for signs of trouble. The Tudor court operated on exactly the same principles, just without the tabloid newspapers and television interviews. The mechanism was the same: a marriage under strain, factions forming around each partner, information and misinformation spreading until it was impossible to separate fact from fiction. Consider the case of Princess Diana centuries later, caught in a marriage that had gone cold, facing a husband whose affections lay elsewhere, watching helplessly as her rival, Camilla Parker Bowles, occupied the emotional space that should have been hers. Diana's situation was not identical to Anne's. Diana was not facing execution, for one thing, but the underlying dynamics were remarkably similar. A woman, a court, or in Diana's case a media establishment, eager to take sides and spread gossip. A public that felt entitled to opinions about the most intimate aspects of her life. Diana famously said that there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. Anne could have said exactly the same thing about Jane Seymour. The difference was that Anne's crowded marriage would end not in divorce but in death. The gossip that swirled around Anne in early 1536 was not limited to her husband's wandering eye. More damaging by far were the whispers about her own alleged infidelities, whispers that would eventually crystallise into formal charges of adultery, incest, and treason. Where did these rumours come from? The historical record is frustratingly unclear. Some historians believe they were deliberately manufactured by Thomas Cromwell as part of a coordinated campaign to destroy Anne. Others suggest they grew organically from the suspicious minds of courtiers who had always believed Anne capable of anything. Still others propose that there was some kernel of truth to the gossip. Not that Anne actually committed adultery, but that she behaved in ways that could be interpreted as flirtatious or inappropriate by those who wanted to interpret them that way. The truth is probably some combination of all 3. Anne was known for her vivacious personality, her enjoyment of male company, her willingness to engage in the kind of witty banter that was standard at the French court, but considered somewhat risque in England. She had male friends, male admirers, men who clustered around her because she was interesting and powerful and fun to be with. In a different context, this would have been perfectly normal behaviour for a queen. In Anne's context, it was ammunition for her enemies. The names that would eventually be attached to the accusations were men from Anne's inner circle: Mark Smeaton, a musician in the royal household, Henry Norris, the groom of the stool and one of Henry's closest personal attendants, Francis Weston, a young courtier known for his charm and good looks, William Brereton, a powerful figure in the Welsh marches, and most shockingly, George Boleyn, Anne's own brother. Each of these men had some connection to Anne, some interaction that could be twisted into evidence of illicit intimacy. Smeaton had performed music for her. Norris had conversed with her frequently as his position required. Weston had been part of her social circle. Brereton had, well, the evidence against Brereton is particularly thin, suggesting he may have been included for political reasons rather than because anyone actually believed Anne had been involved with him. And George was her brother, her closest ally at court, the person she talked to and confided in more than anyone else. The accusation of incest was the most sensational and, frankly, the least believable of all the charges. Even in a court that was willing to believe almost anything about Anne, the idea that she had committed incest with her own brother struck many people as absurd. The Boleyns were ambitious, certainly, and not particularly scrupulous about how they achieved their goals. But incest? That was and yet the charge was made, and the charge stuck, and George Boleyn went to the scaffold alongside the other accused men. The inclusion of incest among the charges served a purpose beyond simply blackening Anne's name. It provided a possible explanation for the deformed fetus she had miscarried in January. If the child had been conceived through incestuous union, the thinking went, that might explain its abnormality. It was a neat piece of circular logic that transformed a personal tragedy into evidence of moral corruption. The construction of the case against Anne was a masterwork of legal manipulation, orchestrated primarily by Thomas Cromwell with whatever assistance he could obtain from Anne's various enemies. Cromwell was not motivated by personal hatred of Anne. His feelings toward her seemed to have been purely practical, but he recognised that Henry wanted to be rid of his wife, and Cromwell was always willing to give Henry what he wanted. The key to the whole operation was Mark Smeaton, the musician. Smeaton was not a gentleman, not a member of the nobility, and therefore not protected by the social conventions that made it difficult to extract confessions from men of higher status. He was arrested on April 30th, 1536, and within hours he had confessed to adultery with the Queen. How was this confession obtained? The historical record does not provide a definitive answer, but the circumstantial evidence suggests that Smeaton was tortured. Torture was technically illegal in England for extracting confessions, but there were ways around that prohibition. The rack could be used with royal authorization, and there were other methods that didn't leave visible marks. Whatever was done to Smeaton, it worked. He confessed, and his confession provided the foundation for everything that followed. Once Smeaton had confessed, the other arrests came quickly. Henry Norris was arrested on May 1st. Anne herself was arrested on May 2nd, taken to the Tower of London in broad daylight, her career as Queen ending as dramatically as it had begun. George Boleyn was arrested the same day. Weston and Brereton followed shortly after. The speed of these arrests suggests that the case had been prepared in advance, the names selected, the evidence, such as it was, assembled, before anyone was actually taken into custody. Cromwell had done his homework. By the time Anne was arrested, her fate was essentially sealed. The trial would be a formality, a public performance designed to legitimize a decision that had already been made. But we should spend more time with the rumours and gossip that laid the groundwork for the arrests, because understanding how Anne's reputation was destroyed helps us understand how the destruction of her body became possible. The court in early 1536 was a hothouse of speculation and intrigue. Everyone knew that Anne's position was precarious. Everyone could see Henry's attention shifting to Jane Seymour. Everyone was trying to figure out which way to jump, how to position themselves for the change that seemed increasingly inevitable. In this atmosphere, rumours about Anne's fidelity began to multiply. Some were probably spontaneous, the natural result of envious minds and wagging tongues. Others were likely planted deliberately, seeds of doubt scattered by Anne's enemies to poison the soil in which her reputation had taken root. The specific allegations that would eventually become formal charges seemed to have coalesced over a period of weeks or months, as various bits of gossip and speculation were collected, sorted and shaped into a coherent narrative. A conversation between Anne and Henry Norris, reported by someone who overheard it, became evidence of illicit intimacy. A gift from Mark Smeaton to one of Anne's ladies was transformed into proof of secret meetings. A moment of physical contact between Anne and her brother, perfectly innocent in context, was twisted into evidence of incestuous desire. This is how reputations are destroyed, not by dramatic revelations or smoking gun evidence, but by the slow accumulation of details, each one innocent on its own but damning in aggregate. Anne's enemies didn't need to prove that she had committed adultery. They just needed to create an atmosphere in which such accusations seemed plausible, an atmosphere in which people were willing to believe the worst about her, because they had been prepared to believe the worst about her. The parallels to modern reputation destruction are striking. Think about how public figures are brought down today, not usually by a single fatal blow, but by 1,000 cuts, each one adding to a narrative of wrongdoing until the target becomes indefensible. Anne was subjected to the 16th century version of this process, a coordinated campaign of whisper and innuendo that transformed her from queen to criminal in a matter of weeks. And just as modern reputation destruction often relies on the target's own words and actions, taken out of context and presented in the worst possible light, so too did the case against Anne rely heavily on things she had actually said and done. The conversation with Norris, for instance, was real. Witnesses had heard it. What Anne and Norris actually discussed, and what that discussion actually meant, became almost irrelevant once it had been reframed as evidence of an affair. The conversation in question happened sometime in April 1536 and concerned, of all things, the question of who might marry Anne if Henry died. Anne apparently suggested that Norris might look to Anne herself in such circumstances, a comment that could be interpreted as flirtatious, as treasonous, or simply as the kind of dark humour that people sometimes engage in when contemplating unpleasant possibilities. Whatever Anne meant by the comment, Norris was disturbed enough by it that he refused to accompany her to the May Day tournament the next day, and the exchange was reported to Cromwell as possible evidence of disloyalty. This was the kind of material Cromwell had to work with. Ambiguous conversations, innocent interactions, the normal social life of a queen reinterpreted through the lens of suspicion and hostility. It wasn't much, but it was enough. In the poisoned atmosphere of early 1536, with Henry actively seeking a way out of his marriage, and everyone at court aware of his wishes, Even the flimsiest evidence could be made to seem significant. The role of Jane Seymour in all of this deserves careful consideration. Jane herself was probably not actively involved in the plot against Anne. She seems to have been more instrument than agent, used by the men around her rather than directing events herself. But her presence in the background, her obvious availability as Anne's replacement, created the conditions that made Anne's destruction both desirable and feasible. Without Jane, Henry might have been willing to simply separate from Anne, as he had separated from Catherine, allowing her to live out her life in comfortable obscurity somewhere away from court. But Jane's availability changed the calculation. Henry could not simply set Anne aside and marry Jane unless Anne was thoroughly discredited. Otherwise, the same arguments that had been used against his marriage to Catherine, that he was still validly married to his first wife, could be used against his marriage to Jane. Anne had to be not just removed, but destroyed. Her marriage not just ended, but annulled. Her very existence as Henry's wife erased from the record. This is the dark logic that drove the accusations of adultery and incest. If Anne had been unfaithful, if she had committed treason against the king's person, then she could be executed rather than merely divorced. And if she was dead, then the question of whether Henry's marriage to her had been valid became moot. He would be a widower, free to marry Jane without any of the complications that had attended his marriage to Anne. Jane herself maintained her pose of innocent virtue throughout these events. She continued to return Henry's gifts, continued to insist on her honour, continued to play the role of the modest maiden who would not compromise herself for any man, even a king. Whether she was genuinely virtuous or simply well coached is impossible to say from this distance, but the effect was the same. She presented a stark contrast to the supposedly depraved Anne, a fresh start untainted by scandal or controversy. The Seymour family, meanwhile, was positioning itself to benefit from Jane's elevation, just as the Boleyn family had benefited from Anne's. Jane's brothers, Edward and Thomas, were both ambitious men who recognised the opportunity that their sister's relationship with the king presented. They coached her in her role, provided political support, and prepared to reap the rewards of her success. This was how the Tudor game was played, families rising and falling based on their access to royal favour, using their women as instruments of advancement, calculating always how to maximise their position and protect their interests. The Boleyns had played this game brilliantly for a generation. Now the Seymours were playing it, using the Boleyns' own strategies against them. Anne watched all of this with the horrified fascination of someone seeing their own past replayed in front of them. She had been Jane Seymour once, the young woman catching the king's eye, being coached by ambitious relatives, holding out for marriage rather than settling for the position of mistress. She knew exactly what Jane was doing because she had done it herself, and she knew, with sickening certainty, that she could not stop it. The court, meanwhile, was adjusting to the new reality with the speed and flexibility that survival required. Those who had risen with Anne began quietly distancing themselves, seeking new patrons, preparing for the change that seemed increasingly inevitable. Those who had opposed Anne from the beginning became bolder, sensing that their moment had finally arrived. Everyone was recalculating, repositioning, trying to figure out how to be on the right side when the dust settled. This is perhaps the cruelest aspect of Anne's fall, the abandonment by people she had trusted, the realization that her so-called friends had been drawn to her power rather than to her person. When the power began to fade, so did the friendship. People who had laughed at her jokes and sought her favour now avoided her company. People who had sworn eternal loyalty suddenly discovered urgent business elsewhere. The court, which had once orbited around her like planets around the sun, was now treating her as if she had become invisible. For Anne, the loneliness must have been almost unbearable. She had never been particularly good at making female friends. Her sharp wit and competitive nature had alienated many of the women who might otherwise have been her allies. Her closest companion had always been her brother George, and he was caught up in his own struggles, facing his own accusations, unable to protect her or even to comfort her in these final weeks. The unravelling of Anne's position accelerated through April 1536. The gossip grew louder, the whispers more insistent. Henry spent more time with Jane and less with Anne. The courtiers who had once competed for Anne's attention now avoided her eyes. Everyone could see what was coming, even if no one knew exactly what form it would take. And then, on May 1st, at a tournament celebrating May Day, everything came to a head. Henry was present, watching the jousting from the royal pavilion. Anne was there too, still officially queen, still maintaining the appearance of normality even as her world collapsed around her. The festivities proceeded as expected, knights charging at each other, lances shattering, crowds cheering, until suddenly Henry rose from his seat and left the tournament without a word. He took only 6 attendants with him. He did not speak to Anne or even look at her as he departed. He simply left, riding away from Greenwich toward Westminster, leaving his wife behind to wonder what had happened. Anne would never see Henry again. In a few hours she would be arrested and taken to the Tower. In less than 3 weeks she would be dead. The tournament on May Day 1536 was the last public event of her reign, a celebration of spring and fertility that became, in retrospect, the beginning of the end. The comparison to modern royal scandals feels particularly apt in this context. Think of all the royal marriages that have unravelled in public, with every stage of the disintegration documented and analysed by millions of observers. The staged photographs, the awkward public appearances, the gradual distancing that everyone can see but no one will acknowledge. Anne's marriage to Henry followed the same trajectory, just compressed into a shorter time frame, and culminating in a far more brutal ending. But there's an important difference between Anne's situation and those of more recent royal figures. Diana and others like her had options, had resources, had the ability to tell their own stories and shape their own narratives. Anne had none of these things. She lived in a world where the king's will was absolute, where there was no appeal beyond Henry's judgment, where the only story that mattered was the story Henry wanted told. When Henry decided that Anne was guilty, or decided that he wanted her to be guilty, which amounted to the same thing, Anne had no recourse. She could not give an interview explaining her side of events. She could not hire a public relations firm to manage her image. She could not even rely on the presumption of innocence, because in Tudor England, accused traitors were guilty until proven otherwise, and proving otherwise was nearly impossible. The web of rumours and accusations that had been woven around Anne was designed to be inescapable. Every strand was connected to every other strand, forming a pattern of supposed depravity that no defence could untangle. Even if Anne could disprove one accusation, there would be others to take its place. The goal was not to build a case that would withstand scrutiny, but to create an atmosphere in which scrutiny became irrelevant, an atmosphere in which everyone simply assumed that Anne must be guilty of something, even if the specific charges were obviously manufactured. This is, of course, how propaganda works. Not by proving a specific proposition, but by creating a general impression that makes specific proof unnecessary. Anne's enemies didn't need people to believe that she had definitely committed adultery with Mark Smeaton on this date and at this location. They just needed people to believe that Anne was the kind of person who would commit adultery, that she was morally corrupt, sexually depraved, capable of anything. Once that belief took hold, the specific details became almost irrelevant. The destruction of Anne Boleyn's reputation was, in many ways, more thorough than the destruction of her body. Her execution lasted only seconds. Her reputation has been debated for 5 centuries. Even today, opinions about Anne vary wildly. Some see her as a victim of injustice, others as an ambitious schemer who got what she deserved. Still others as something more complicated, a woman who was neither wholly innocent nor wholly guilty but simply human, caught in a system that destroyed her. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that the accusations against Anne were almost certainly false, or at least wildly exaggerated. The evidence was too thin, the timing too convenient, the benefit to Henry too obvious. If Anne had actually been conducting multiple simultaneous affairs with 5 different men, including her own brother, someone would have talked, servants would have noticed, evidence would have accumulated, the secret would have been impossible to keep. The fact that no such evidence emerged, that the case rested entirely on tortured confessions and ambiguous conversations, tells us everything we need to know about its legitimacy. But legitimacy didn't matter. Henry wanted Anne gone, and Henry was the king. The law was whatever Henry said it was. The truth was whatever Henry needed it to be. And Anne, for all her wit and intelligence and survival instincts, could not escape the fundamental reality of her situation. She was a woman in a world ruled by men, and the most powerful man in England had decided that she should die. The web of rumours that had been spun around her had done its job. It had made her destruction seem not just acceptable but necessary, a matter of royal security, of national interest, of divine justice. The woman who had risen so high through the power of words and reputation was now being destroyed by words and reputation, undone by the same forces that had made her. Jane Seymour waited in the wings, ready to step into the role that Anne was being forced to vacate. The Seymour family was ready to take over from the Boleyns. The court was ready to adjust to the new reality. Everyone was ready in fact except Anne, and Anne's readiness was no longer relevant. The story moves now from rumour to reality, from whispers to warrants, from the slow-motion destruction of a reputation to the swift destruction of a life. The arrests are coming. The trials are coming. The executions are coming. Everything we have discussed so far has been leading to this moment, the moment when Anne Boleyn ceases to be queen and becomes prisoner, when the web of rumours becomes a web of chains. Let the weight of what we've discussed settle into your mind. The rise of Jane Seymour and the fall of Anne Boleyn. The parallels to other royal scandals across the centuries. The mechanics of reputation destruction, as relevant today as they were 500 years ago. The cruel efficiency of the Tudor court, turning against Anne with the same speed and ruthlessness with which it had once elevated her. The next chapter will bring us to the Tower itself, to the trials and the executions and the final words of a woman who never stopped protesting her innocence. But for now, we rest here, at the moment when Anne's fate became sealed, when the whispers became accusations, when the rumours became charges, when the possibility of destruction became the certainty of death. The story continues toward its terrible conclusion. But before we move on, let us dwell a little longer on some aspects of this period that deserve more attention. The mechanics of Anne's fall, the role of various players in her destruction, and the broader context of how powerful women were treated in Tudor England all merit further exploration. Consider, for instance, the position of Jane Seymour during these crucial months. She was in many ways playing an extremely dangerous game. History is full of would-be royal favourites who misread the situation, who pushed too hard or moved too fast, who ended up destroyed alongside the queen they were trying to replace, rather than triumphant in her place. Jane's success was not guaranteed. It depended on a delicate calibration of signals, on giving Henry enough encouragement to keep his interest, while maintaining enough distance to preserve her reputation for virtue. The fact that Jane pulled this off successfully suggests either remarkable personal skill or more likely very skilled handlers. Her brother Edward Seymour and his allies seem to have managed Jane's courtship with the king as carefully as any modern political campaign. They understood what Henry wanted, not just sexually but emotionally and politically, and they crafted Jane's presentation to appeal to all of these desires. What Henry wanted, it seems, was a reset. He wanted to forget about the drama and controversy of his marriage to Anne and start fresh with a woman who would cause no scandal, create no religious upheaval, and simply produce healthy sons without any of the complications that Anne had brought. Jane was packaged as exactly this woman: quiet, submissive, fertile-looking, unthreatening. She would be everything Anne was not, including, and this was perhaps the most important thing, grateful for the position rather than treating it as her due. Anne had never been properly grateful in Henry's view. She had acted as if she deserved to be queen, as if Henry owed her something for all the years she'd waited. This attitude, charming during the courtship, had become irritating once Anne was actually on the throne. Henry didn't want a partner who considered herself his equal. He wanted a wife who understood her place and stayed in it. Jane apparently understood this, or was taught to understand it. Her motto as queen would be bound to obey and serve, a stark contrast to Anne's the most happy. Where Anne had asserted herself, Jane would subordinate herself. Where Anne had challenged Henry, Jane would defer to him. Where Anne had been a rival personality competing for dominance, Jane would be a complement, a support, a restful presence rather than an exhausting one. But the persona worked. It gave Henry exactly what he wanted at exactly the moment he wanted it, and it provided a stark contrast to Anne that made Anne's alleged faults seem even more glaring. The propaganda value of this contrast cannot be overstated. Every time Jane demurely lowered her eyes, she implicitly criticised Anne's bold gaze. Every time Jane deferred to Henry's judgment, she implicitly condemned Anne's willfulness. Every time Jane behaved with quiet propriety, she reinforced the narrative that Anne had been improper, immodest, unfit for her position. Jane didn't have to say anything negative about Anne. Her very existence was a criticism. This is sophisticated reputation management, whether or not anyone at the time would have used that phrase. The Seymour faction understood that the best way to attack Anne was not through direct assault but through comparison, by presenting an alternative that made Anne's flaws seem more obvious and her removal more necessary. They didn't need to prove that Anne was a bad queen. They just needed to show that Jane would be a better one. Meanwhile, the actual machinery of Anne's destruction was being assembled by Thomas Cromwell and his allies. Cromwell's role in the fall of Anne Boleyn has been debated by historians for centuries. Some see him as the mastermind of the whole operation, manufacturing evidence and orchestrating arrests to serve his own political agenda. Others view him as a servant carrying out Henry's wishes, doing what he had to do to survive in a dangerous court. Still others suggest a middle position, that Cromwell recognised Henry's desire to be rid of Anne and provided the legal and practical framework for making that happen, without necessarily initiating the process himself. What seems clear is that Cromwell approached the task with his characteristic efficiency and thoroughness. He gathered information, identified potential witnesses, constructed a narrative that would justify the extreme measures Henry wanted to take. He was, in modern terms, building a prosecution case, except that in Tudor England the prosecution was also the investigation, the judge, and in effect the jury. The accused had few rights and no real opportunity to mount a defence. Once Cromwell decided someone was guilty, they were almost certainly doomed. The gathering of evidence against Anne seems to have accelerated in April 1536, though the groundwork may have been laid earlier. Cromwell was looking for anything that could be twisted into proof of adultery or treason, conversations that could be misinterpreted, gestures that could be misconstrued, relationships that could be reframed as inappropriate. He found what he was looking for, not because Anne had actually committed any crimes, but because court life provided an endless supply of ambiguous material that could be made to look suspicious if you were determined to make it look suspicious. The treatment of Mark Smeaton deserves particular attention because his confession was so crucial to the case. Smeaton was a commoner, a musician who had risen through talent to a position in the royal household. He was young, probably handsome, and devoted to Anne in the way that artists sometimes become devoted to their patrons. There is no credible evidence that this devotion was ever reciprocated or that it crossed any improper boundaries. But Smeaton's lowly origins made him vulnerable in a way that the other accused men were not. As a commoner, he could be tortured without the legal protections that covered nobles. And torture, as interrogators throughout history have discovered, tends to produce the confessions that interrogators want to hear. People in enough pain will say anything to make the pain stop, and Smeaton apparently said what Cromwell needed him to say. The details of Smeaton's interrogation are not recorded, but circumstantial evidence suggests it was brutal. He was arrested on April 30th and had confessed by the end of the day, far too quickly for anything resembling a genuine investigation. Some sources suggest he was racked. Others mention a rope knotted around his head that was gradually tightened, causing excruciating pain without leaving visible marks. Whatever was done to him, it worked. Smeaton's confession implicated not just himself but Anne, and that confession became the foundation for everything that followed. Once Cromwell had a confession in hand, even a tortured, unreliable confession from a man who would have said anything to stop the pain, he could present the case to Henry as essentially proven. The king's suspicions had been confirmed. The queen had been unfaithful. The honour of the crown had been violated. From that point, the arrests proceeded with terrifying speed. Henry Norris, the groom of the stool and one of Henry's closest personal attendants, was taken into custody on May 1st. The king himself interrogated Norris, offering him a pardon if he would confess to adultery with Anne. Norris refused. He maintained his innocence to the end, despite every inducement and threat. His refusal should have raised questions about the validity of the case, but in the poisoned atmosphere of May 1536, such questions were not being asked. Anne's arrest on May 2nd was conducted with a kind of formal cruelty that demonstrated just how completely her position had collapsed. She was taken to the Tower of London by barge, following the same route she had travelled 3 years earlier for her coronation, a deliberate echo that could not have been accidental. The woman who had entered the Tower as queen was now entering it as prisoner, and everyone involved wanted to emphasise the reversal. The Tower, it was the place where enemies of the crown were held, questioned and often executed. Its walls had witnessed some of the darkest moments in English history. Entering the Tower as a prisoner was in itself a statement of the seriousness of the charges and the likely outcome of the case. Anne was placed in the same royal apartments where she had stayed before her coronation. The irony was vicious. The rooms that had hosted her triumph would now witness her destruction. She was attended by women who had been specifically chosen because they were unsympathetic to her. Women who would report everything she said and did to Cromwell and the king. She was, in effect, under constant surveillance, her every word a potential piece of evidence. The reports that survive from Anne's imprisonment suggest a woman oscillating between terror and defiance, between acceptance and disbelief. She laughed inappropriately, wept unexpectedly, alternated between proclaiming her innocence and wondering aloud what she had done to deserve such treatment. These reactions have been interpreted in various ways, as evidence of guilt, as signs of mental breakdown, as natural responses to an impossible situation. The truth is probably that Anne was a human being facing death and responding the way human beings respond, inconsistently, emotionally, without the composed dignity that we might imagine from historical distance. The men accused of being Anne's lovers were arrested over the following days: Francis Weston, William Brereton, and George Boleyn. Each maintained his innocence. Each was nonetheless doomed. The trials were scheduled for May 12th for the four commoners and May 15th for Anne and George, and the outcomes were foreordained. Tudor treason trials were not designed to determine guilt or innocence. They were designed to legitimize decisions that had already been made. But we are getting ahead of our story. We should pause here at the moment of the arrests and consider what had been accomplished in the preceding months. Through a combination of rumour, innuendo, manufactured evidence, and tortured confessions, Thomas Cromwell and his allies had transformed Anne Boleyn from Queen of England to accused traitor. They had done so in a matter of weeks, with a speed and efficiency that suggests careful advance planning. And they had done so in a way that left Anne almost no opportunity to defend herself. The web of rumours that had been spun around Anne had served its purpose perfectly. It had created an atmosphere in which the accusations seemed plausible, in which people were willing to believe the worst about her, in which her destruction could be presented as a matter of justice rather than politics. The propaganda had worked. Anne's reputation had been destroyed so thoroughly that her physical destruction seemed almost like an afterthought. Jane Seymour, meanwhile, remained carefully in the background, maintaining her pose of innocent virtue while the woman she was replacing was torn apart. Jane's handlers understood that any sign of triumph, any indication that she was benefiting from Anne's fall, would undermine the narrative they were trying to construct. Jane was not a schemer who had displaced a rival. She was a modest maiden who had caught the king's eye through no effort of her own. That was the story, and everyone was sticking to it. The parallels to modern media scandals are once again striking. Think about how public figures are destroyed today. The initial accusations, the pile-on of additional charges, the abandonment by former allies, the destruction of reputation that precedes any legal process. Anne experienced all of this, just compressed into a shorter time frame and with higher stakes. She was cancelled in modern terms, except that her cancellation meant losing her head rather than losing her Twitter account. The question of whether Anne was innocent is complicated by the nature of the charges against her. Was she innocent of adultery? Almost certainly. The evidence is too thin, the timing too convenient, the beneficiaries too obvious. Was she innocent of the kind of flirtatious behaviour that could be interpreted as improper? Perhaps not. She seems to have enjoyed male company and witty banter in ways that gave her enemies ammunition. Was she innocent of ambition, of scheming, of using whatever tools were available to advance her position? Certainly not. But then, neither was anyone else at the Tudor court. The charges against Anne were designed not to reflect her actual crimes, but to justify her removal. She was accused of adultery because adultery by a queen was treason, and treason was punishable by death. She was accused of incest to add additional horror to the charges, and to suggest that she was capable of any depravity. She was accused of plotting the king's death to make her removal seem not just justified, but necessary for national security. None of these charges needed to be true. They just needed to provide legal cover for what Henry wanted to do. And in Tudor England, the king's will was law. If Henry wanted Anne dead, Anne would die. The only question was what explanation would be offered to the world. The explanation that Cromwell constructed was effective precisely because it drew on existing prejudices and suspicions. Anne had always been seen as dangerously sexual, her hold over Henry attributed to witchcraft or seduction, rather than any more respectable qualities. The accusation of incest went even further, suggesting that Anne's sexual depravity knew no bounds. And the accusation of plotting Henry's death provided a motive for all the other crimes. Anne had betrayed her husband because she planned to replace him, to rule through one of her lovers or through her daughter Elizabeth. It was a coherent story, even if it wasn't true. It explained Anne's behaviour, justified her punishment, and protected Henry's reputation as a deceived husband rather than a faithless one. The story served everyone's interests, except, of course, Anne's. The destruction of Anne Boleyn stands as one of the most effective propaganda operations in English history. In the space of a few weeks, a crowned queen was transformed into an executed criminal, her reputation so thoroughly blackened that even today, 5 centuries later, debates about her guilt or innocence continue. The whisper campaign, the manufactured evidence, the tortured confession, the show trial, all of these tools were deployed with ruthless efficiency to achieve the desired result. And at the centre of it all, pulling the strings, was Henry VIII, the king who had loved Anne, or said he had loved her and who now wanted her dead. Henry did not personally construct the case against Anne. That was Cromwell's work. But Henry approved it, enabled it, and ultimately benefited from it. Without the king's will, none of this would have happened. With the king's will, there was no way to stop it. Jane Seymour would become queen within 2 weeks of Anne's execution. The Seymour family would rise to prominence just as the Boleyn family fell into disgrace. The cycle would continue, with Henry accumulating wives and disposing of them according to his shifting desires and needs. Anne was not the first wife he discarded. Catherine of Aragon had that dubious honour, and she would not be the last. Jane, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr, all of them would follow Anne into the role of royal consort, and all of them would discover in different ways just how dangerous that role could be. But Anne's story is unique in its combination of height and depth, of triumph and tragedy. She rose higher than any of the others, not just to the position of queen, but to the status of religious revolutionary, the woman who helped break England from Rome. And she fell harder than any of the others, not just divorced or ignored, but executed, her crimes proclaimed to the world, her memory blackened for generations. The web of rumours that entangled her was not just a collection of lies. It was a system, a technology for destroying people that would be refined and deployed again and again throughout history. Understanding how it worked helps us understand not just Anne Boleyn, but all the countless other victims of coordinated reputation destruction, from Tudor England to the present day. The story continues now toward its final chapters, the trials, the executions, the last words of a queen who never stopped protesting her innocence. But the essential work of destruction was already done by this point. Anne's fate was sealed the moment Henry decided he wanted to be rid of her. Everything that followed, the arrests, the interrogations, the legal proceedings, was just formality, the elaborate machinery of the Tudor state grinding toward its predetermined conclusion. Let the story settle into your mind as we prepare for the final act. The web has been woven. The trap has been sprung. Anne Boleyn, once the most powerful woman in England, is now a prisoner in the Tower, awaiting the judgment that everyone knows is coming. The end approaches. The trials that sealed Anne Boleyn's fate were, in the most technical sense, legal proceedings. There were judges, there were charges, there was testimony, and there were verdicts. All the formal requirements of English law were observed, and yet everyone involved understood that the outcome had been determined before the first word was spoken. This was not justice in any meaningful sense. It was theatre, a performance designed to provide legal cover for a decision that Henry VIII had already made. The first trials took place on May 12, 1536 in Westminster Hall. The 4 commoners accused of adultery with the Queen, Mark Smeaton, Henry Norris, Francis Weston and William Brereton, were brought before a special commission and charged with high treason. The specific allegation was that they had violated the Queen, which in Tudor legal language meant they had committed adultery with her. Since the Queen's body belonged to the King, adultery with the Queen was not merely a personal offence but a crime against the Crown itself, hence the charge of treason rather than simple adultery. The proceedings were swift and one-sided. The accused had no lawyers, no opportunity to call witnesses in their defence, and limited ability to challenge the evidence against them. Mark Smeaton, the only one who had confessed, confirmed his earlier statement. The other 3 maintained their innocence, but their denials counted for little against the weight of the prosecution's case. The evidence presented was thin to the point of absurdity. Conversations that could be interpreted in multiple ways were presented as proof of illicit intimacy. Gifts and gestures that meant nothing in themselves were woven into a narrative of secret assignations. The prosecution didn't need to prove beyond reasonable doubt. They just needed to create an impression of guilt, and the jury, knowing what the king wanted, was prepared to be impressed. All 4 men were found guilty. This was not unusual for the period. It was the standard punishment for male traitors, but it reminds us of just how brutal Tudor justice could be. The fact that these men were almost certainly innocent makes the sentence even more horrifying. In the event, Henry commuted their sentences to simple beheading, a mercy of sorts. They would still die, but at least they would die relatively quickly, without the extended torture that the full sentence of treason entailed. Whether this commutation reflected any doubt about their guilt or simply Henry's desire to avoid an unseemly spectacle, we cannot say. 3 days later, on May 15th, it was Anne's turn. She was tried not in Westminster Hall, but in the Great Hall of the Tower of London, before an audience that reportedly numbered around 2,000 people. This was a show trial in the most literal sense, a public performance designed to demonstrate the king's justice and the Queen's guilt to as large an audience as possible. The Lord High Steward who presided over the trial was Anne's own uncle, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk. This might seem like a conflict of interest, but in Tudor England, family connections were no barrier to judicial duties, especially when the outcome was foreordained. Norfolk had long resented the Boleyns' rise to power and was perfectly willing to preside over his niece's destruction, if that was what the king required. The charges against Anne were read out in exhaustive detail. She was accused of committing adultery with the 5 men already convicted or awaiting trial. She was accused of incest with her brother George. She was accused of promising to marry one of her lovers after the king's death. She was accused of giving gifts to her lovers. She was accused of poisoning Catherine of Aragon and plotting to poison Princess Mary. And underlying all these specific charges was the general accusation that she had despised her marriage and conspired the king's death. The evidence presented was largely the same material that had been used against the male defendants: ambiguous conversations, innocent gestures reinterpreted as sinister, the tortured confession of Mark Smeaton. Anne was allowed to respond to each charge, and she did so with the eloquence and composure that had always been among her greatest assets. She denied everything. She denied the adultery, denied the incest, denied any desire to harm the king. She pointed out inconsistencies in the prosecution's timeline, dates when she was alleged to have committed adultery but was actually elsewhere, demonstrably in the king's company or otherwise accounted for. She spoke clearly and persuasively, and observers noted that she acquitted herself remarkably well under the circumstances. But none of it mattered. The jury, composed of peers who knew exactly what verdict was expected of them, found her guilty on all counts. The sentence was death, either by burning, the traditional punishment for a woman convicted of treason, or beheading at the king's pleasure. Anne received the verdict with what witnesses described as remarkable composure. She did not collapse, did not beg for mercy, did not create the kind of scene that might have provided her enemies with additional ammunition. Instead, she made a short speech that has been preserved in various versions by different witnesses. "I do not say I have always borne towards the king the humility which I owed him," she said, or words to that effect. "I confess I have had jealous fancies and suspicions of him, which I had not discretion enough and wisdom to conceal at all times. But God knows, and is my witness, that I have not sinned against him in any other way." It was a masterful piece of rhetoric. Anne acknowledged that she had been a difficult wife, jealous, argumentative, insufficiently submissive. But she denied absolutely the charges that actually mattered: the adultery, the incest, the treason. She was admitting to being human, to having flaws, while maintaining her innocence of any crime deserving death. Her brother George was tried immediately after her, before the same audience and the same jury. George put up an even more vigorous defence than Anne had, challenging the evidence with a lawyer's precision and refusing to be cowed by the gravity of the proceedings. At one point he was handed a piece of paper containing an allegation so scandalous that the court had hoped he would merely confirm it rather than reading it aloud. George, in an act of defiance that horrified the prosecutors, read the allegation out loud for the entire hall to hear. It was a bold move, and a futile one. George was found guilty, just as Anne had been, and sentenced to death. The brothers and sisters would die together, their family's rapid rise matched by an equally rapid fall. The reactions to the verdicts varied depending on who was doing the reacting. Anne's enemies celebrated, though discreetly. Open celebration might seem inappropriate, and might also attract unwanted attention from a king who was notoriously fickle. Anne's supporters, such as they were, mourned in private, afraid to show their grief too publicly. And the broader court simply adjusted to the new reality, as courts always do, shifting their allegiances from the falling Boleyns to the rising Seymours. Henry himself received the news of the verdicts with apparent satisfaction. He had the days between the verdict and the execution were a strange limbo for Anne. She knew she was going to die, but she didn't know exactly when or how. The original plan called for her execution on May 18th, but delays pushed it back to May 19th. The uncertainty must have been agonizing, each morning wondering if this was the day, each evening going to bed not knowing if she would wake up. During this period, Anne seems to have made a kind of peace with her fate. The hysterical outbursts that had characterized her early days in the Tower gave way to a calmer, more resigned demeanor. She prayed frequently, took communion, and spent time with the women who attended her, though those women, as we've noted, had been specifically chosen to spy on her and report her words to Cromwell. She also made one final extraordinary request. Rather than being executed by the traditional English axe, she asked to be beheaded by sword. This was the method used in France, where Anne had spent so many formative years, and it was considered quicker and more reliable than the axe. Henry granted this request, sending to Calais for an expert swordsman who was renowned for the speed and precision of his work. This was, in its way, a final act of mercy from Henry, or at least what passed for mercy in the brutal calculus of Tudor justice. Anne would die, but she would die quickly, cleanly, without the botched strokes and agonizing delays that sometimes accompanied axe executions. It was a small comfort, but it was apparently a comfort that Anne appreciated. "I heard say the executioner was very good," she told the constable of the Tower, "and I have a little neck." Then she laughed, putting her hands around her throat in a gesture that combined dark humour with what must have been genuine terror. The trial of Anne Boleyn has been analysed and debated by historians for nearly 5 centuries now, and the consensus is overwhelming. She was not guilty of the crimes for which she died. The evidence was fabricated, the confession tortured out of an unreliable witness, the timeline riddled with impossibilities. Anne was executed not because she'd committed adultery or treason, but because Henry wanted to be rid of her, and Cromwell provided the legal mechanism for making that happen. But if we step back from the question of Anne's guilt and consider the broader significance of her trial, we see something equally important: the demonstration of royal power in its most naked form. Henry was showing the world, and particularly his own subjects, that he could do whatever he wanted, that his will was law, that no one was safe from his displeasure. The Queen herself, the mother of his child, the woman he had once loved passionately enough to overturn the religious order of Europe, even she could be destroyed if she fell out of favour. This was a terrifying message, and it was received loud and clear. After Anne's execution, Henry's subjects knew exactly what kind of king they were dealing with. The charming young prince of the early reign had revealed himself as something darker, something more dangerous. And while some people had suspected this all along, Anne's trial and execution made it impossible to ignore. The morning of May 19th, 1536 dawned clear and fine, one of those perfect English spring mornings that seem to mock human suffering with their beauty. Inside the Tower of London, Anne Boleyn rose early and prepared herself for the last time. She dressed carefully in a grey damask gown over a crimson kirtle, the colours of mourning and martyrdom combined in a single outfit. Her dark hair was pinned up, her famous neck exposed. She attended Mass, received communion, and made her final peace with God. The execution had been scheduled for early morning, but further delays pushed it back to around 9 o'clock. Anne spent the extra hours in prayer and conversation with her attendants. At one point she apparently made a grim joke about her situation, saying that she would be known as Queen Anne Lackhead, a reference to the fate awaiting her. Tudor humour, it seems, could be as dark as any era's. When the summons finally came, Anne walked to the scaffold with what witnesses described as remarkable composure. The scaffold had been erected on Tower Green within the walls of the fortress, rather than on Tower Hill where public executions normally took place. This meant a smaller audience, perhaps 1,000 people rather than the thousands who might have gathered for a public spectacle. But Anne's death was still very much a public event, witnessed by officials, nobles and foreign ambassadors who would report what they saw to their own governments. She climbed the steps of the scaffold with assistance from her attendants. Her legs were reportedly unsteady, though whether from fear or simply from the weight of her elaborate dress we cannot say. At the top she turned to face the assembled crowd and was permitted to make a final speech. Anne's scaffold speech has been preserved in several slightly different versions, but the essential content is consistent across all accounts. She did not proclaim her innocence outright. That would have been seen as contempt for the verdict and might have endangered those she left behind. But she did not confess to any crimes either. Instead, she spoke carefully, ambiguously, leaving room for interpretation while maintaining her dignity. "Good Christian people," she began, "I am come hither to die, according to the law, and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it." Notice the careful phrasing. She acknowledged that she had been judged to die according to the law. She did not say she was guilty. She did not say the judgment was just. She simply accepted it because she had no other choice. She went on to speak kindly of Henry, calling him a most gentle and merciful prince, and asking that God preserve him and grant him long life to reign over England. This too was carefully calculated. Speaking ill of the king might endanger her daughter Elizabeth, who was still in Henry's power. Whatever Anne truly felt about the man who was killing her, she kept those feelings hidden behind a mask of diplomatic courtesy. If any, but even when she had Her ladies-in-waiting, weeping openly now, helped with this final preparation. One of them tied a blindfold over Anne's eyes, a mercy or perhaps a cruelty, depending on whether you think it's better to see death coming or to meet it in darkness. Anne knelt on the straw that had been spread to absorb her blood. She did not use a block. The French method required the condemned to kneel upright, their neck unsupported, trusting entirely in the skill of the executioner. She began to pray, repeating the phrase, "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul," over and over again. The executioner, that expert swordsman from Calais, brought specially for this occasion, approached quietly, having removed his shoes so that Anne would not hear his footsteps. According to some accounts, he called out to his assistant to bring me the sword, causing Anne to turn her head slightly toward the sound. In that moment of distraction he struck. The